This long-winded intro will only be in this video. The remaining videos in this series will pick up where the chapter starts and immediately take off. The author wanted this to be a big production, but the cost of that was far too high. It truly be rough out here, so you are stuck with me. I'm Theo. Joey, the author, feels too stupid to read the audiobook himself, so he has made me do it. You can laugh at the stupid robot if I made a reading mistake. Ha ha. Anyway, let's get started. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced in any form, or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording, or any information browsing, storage, or retrieval system, without permission in writing from FriesenPress. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Warning: this story contains crude language, excessive violence, drug use, alcohol use, and sexual content. The author doesn't shy away from having characters in the universe say and do some of the darkest things he can think of in his mind. One of the main topics in this universe is about unaliving yourself. It will be a great source of entertainment for the first half of you while deeply offending the second half. This is not a happy story about puppy dogs and rainbows. Viewer discretion is advised. The author is doing his best with following YouTube's terms of service by censoring a lot of the crude language and removing the adult scenes altogether. To fully experience the Sins of 8 universe, support Joey by purchasing a physical copy or ebook from the many stores where it is available. Without further ado, here is Sins of 8 Book 1, written by Canadian author Joey Bissine. We hope you enjoy it. Prologue. A group of men dressed in suits walked through the entrance of a strip club, all excited to see the naked women with their favorite drink. "We fucking did it," one of them said. "I can't believe it's finally over." The leader, Baron, had a long-lasting grin on his face as he turned to the group. "All of you find a girl and get fucked up." They all cackled and walked farther into the club. Baron turned to a man wearing a smile that could cut glass. The man wore a beige suit vest and a black bandana wrapped around his left bicep. A withered white lily was neatly tucked beneath it. An eccentric-looking katana was attached to his hip. The scabbard had the appearance of a pale, detached limb. "Hey, Aiden!" Baron shouted, beckoning him. Aiden heard the faint sound of his voice and ambled toward him. "It's far too loud in here," Baron said. "Let's go outside and have a smoke." "Yay, I have something important to say." Aiden nodded, and they headed to the front entrance of the club, passing the bouncer and a couple of strippers who wore fur coats with knee-high boots. Outside, the icy wind sent chills over their bodies. When they exhaled, clouds of condensation blew out of their mouths. They both grabbed cigarettes and lit them. Baron took a drag from his cigarette and turned to Aiden. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he said. "It's unfortunate that Flynn is still missing." "I'm sorry. I can tell that you are hurting a lot." Aiden took a drag from his cigarette and nodded. "I'm just trying to find a way out." Do you know who did it to him? Behran nodded and stared at the ground. He took another drag from his cigarette and looked back at Aiden. The dark circles under Behran's eyes spoke more than words. We're finally together, he chuckled. We're all celebrating. We're all here. When we're done with the party, we can all go home and do what we want. He finished his cigarette and flicked it to the ground. All right, I'm done wasting your time. I know he meant a lot to you. You went through so much, so here it goes. Aiden waited for Behran to speak while he lit another cigarette. A mysterious figure appeared in the shadows. It wore a crimson-red robe with goat horns protruding through the top of its hood. Four yellow glowing eyes glared at the two of them. Its face was masked by the shadow of its hood. Behran took a step back and slid his hands into his jacket pockets. It was us, he said, taking a deep breath. Aiden stared at the wall with a blank expression and flicked his cigarette. Remaining silent, he grabbed another cigarette from the pack in his suit pocket. Thinking Aiden was reaching for a weapon, Behran stared at Aiden while he grasped something in his own pocket. Look, we didn't want to, Behran explained. We were forced to do it. It was either him or us. I think telling you is the right thing to do. Aiden flicked his cigarette and locked eyes with Behran. He held back every impulsive thought in his head and took a deep breath of fresh air. He reached for his pack of cigarettes and lit another one. She would have wanted you to kill him for this, Aiden, a voice whispered. A dense cloud of red smoke covered Aiden's hands as he tore Behran's arm, then grabbed his pistol off the ground and wasted the entire clip into his face. He stared at his corpse with a crazy-minded gleam. Moments later, his episode faded. Behran stood in front of him in perfect health. The mysterious being in the distance grinned, baring its pearly white fangs. A woman made us do it, Behran explained. She thought that it was the push you needed. Aiden raised his hand and interrupted him. The push I needed. Behran wore a shaky smile. Shia said you kept resisting, that you had the potential, but he was holding you back. If he's out of the picture, you'd either give up or help her. The mysterious figure snarled and disappeared into the shadows. Behran narrowed his brows. I feel like you had to know, he explained. I didn't want you to drag your knuckles forever, you know. I've felt terrible about this for a while. Just don't tell anyone I told you, okay? Let NVIDIA tell you everything. I'm doing you a favor here. You should know this before he fucks you without so much as a thank you. Aiden caught glimpse of a half-naked stripper who got out of her car, checking her out while he took a drag from his cigarette. He caressed the withered lily on his arm with his fingertips as he flicked the cigarette toward the snowy gravel. Aiden lit another cigarette and turned to Behran. I'm going to stay outside and think to myself for a bit. Behran nodded and patted his shoulder. You got it. Then made his way into the strip club. Aiden felt a strange presence coming from the alleyway and saw nothing but dirt and snow. A cloud of smoke formed from all directions and solidified into a massive hulking figure behind him. The giant had leathery black skin with the head of a wolf and razor-sharp fangs. Its illuminating blood-red eyes had a pupillar duplex. Aiden took the final drag from his cigarette and flicked it. The giant beast took a deep breath and lowered its head down to Aiden's left shoulder. What the fuck, Aiden? The beast shouted, loudly exhaling through its nostrils. Aiden stared at the cigarette butts on the ground and shoved his hands into his suit pockets. The beast's eyes bulged out of its head. This is fucked, Aiden. Do it already and kill them. Aiden scouted the area for witnesses. The hooded creature appeared at the top of a building, out of Aiden's line of sight. It watched him with its shinning grin. Aiden took a deep breath and looked over his shoulder. There's no fucking way I'm giving up now, Seven, he said as he ambled toward the bouncer. Seven cackled as he watched. Aiden coughed up a viscous black ooze and spat it onto the worn-out concrete. He cleared his throat and took a deep breath before turning to Seven once more. "I guess we're both not going to get what we want." Seven arched his neck back and guffawed. Delicious. The hair on Seven's skin stood on end as he loomed over Aiden, salivating at the thought of carnage. Aiden saw the hooded creature's golden eyes in his peripheral vision and turned in its direction. Seven looked over his shoulder and stared at the mysterious entity with his protruding eyes. "Look at what we have here, kiddo. An audience." He chuckled. Aiden locked eyes with Seven, and a mysterious fog shrouded his body. The bouncer squinted his eyes, examining him from afar. "Is he okay?" He then approached Aiden and patted him on the shoulder. The heat that emanated off Aiden's body burned his hand, leaving a hissing sound. "Ugh!" the bouncer cried. Aiden's eye contact with Seven remained unbroken. He saw nothing but Seven's blood-red eyes. Patterns from a kaleidoscope flooded Aiden's vision. Millions of images from his life flashed through his mind. Moments later, they shrank into his pupils and faded away. The bouncer held his burned hand as he ground his teeth. He saw the darkness in Aiden's eyes and shrank away. Aiden closed them and brought himself to his treehouse in an infinite Capri-blue forest. He waved his hand, setting the entirety of it ablaze with a roaring fire. The murky clouds above his head cried out with a thunderous rainstorm. Music blared out of the strip club speakers, leaking out of the building. Aiden opened his eyes and glanced at the bouncer's name tag. James, then slowed time down as he cocked his head. James' face lit up as he took a step back. "Are you okay?" he asked in slow motion. Aiden broadened his eyes and glared at him with an ominous grin. James dropped to the ground and stared at him with sallow and pitted skin. Aiden looked down at him before picking his nose and flicking it in James' face. The moment a nose nugget touched his face, James flinched as he stared into Aiden's void-like eyes. Aiden grabbed James by the collar and lifted him onto his feet. James had uncontrollable facial tics. Seven pointed at him with a piercing glare as he cackled. "What a pussy." Aiden cranked his arm backward and punched James in the face with his extraordinary speed. His neck snapped immediately, and he floated upward as if gravity didn't exist. Aiden grabbed his ankle and threw his body toward the club entrance with all of his might. The front door blew off its hinges and flew deeper into the club. Aiden looked into the open doorway and ambled inside. Seven followed him, laughing hysterically. The civilians inside shrieked as they dotted for the backstage area. Aiden spotted the group of men he showed up with. All of them predicted Aiden's rage and morphed into scarlet-skinned demons. Aiden leaped toward Baron, and Superman punched him into the back end of the club. Baron's men raced toward Aiden and attacked him. One of them punched Aiden in the face, breaking his hand. The grinding of Aiden's teeth brought out the rigid cords in his neck. He grabbed the demon by the neck and kneed it in the face with enough force to cave it in, then promptly threw the demon's cadaver toward the group. They froze as they stared at the corpse. Seven morphed back into his human form and ate candy from his brown paper bag. Another demon charged at Aiden and hit him in the head with a vicious kick. Aiden grabbed the demon's leg and threw it into the bar area next to them. The ground was littered with broken glass and stripper-profile cods. Two men pulled out Chris Vector model machine guns and fired an entire magazine at him. Aiden quickly jumped behind the bar and disappeared. One of them ground their teeth as they glared at the bar. "Fuck that dipshit." He slowly approached the messy countertop and checked both ends before he realized Aiden had gone missing, then turned around and saw his friend on his knees with his head twisted 180 degrees. The hole in his chest was big enough to see through his body. Blood poured out of the open cavity and pooled onto the floor by his knees. The last man standing tossed his machine gun and darted for the front entrance. "Ugh!" he cried. I then glided from the ceiling and thrust his katana into the man, then turned the hilt and effortlessly raised it through his body. I then promptly collected himself and stretched. 7 leaned to the left and dropped his bag of candy on the floor. "Freeze!" a SWAT officer screamed. A squad of soldiers quickly lined up behind him. 7 turned to Iden and slapped the backside of his head. "They can see your face, dumbass." Iden turned to 7 and watched him pick up his beloved candy. "Yeah, no shit, 7, they would know it was me." Regardless of that, the SWAT lead aimed his rifle at Iden. "Stay there. Put your hands on your head. Now, this is your first and last warning." Iden glared at the officer with narrowed brows. "Him and his goddamn bullshit," he muttered, and slid his hands into his suit pockets. Iden stared at the SWAT leader and his officers until he realized time went still. He looked down at his watch, and the arms didn't move. He turned to the flowing water that poured out of the broken pipes and noticed that it was frozen. The SWAT officers looked like Quack's doppelgangers. Time no longer existed. 7 shook the bottom of his paper bag and only paid attention to his candy. Viscous raven black ooze dripped onto the floor just a few feet from them. The ooze poured into a pool that grew 5 feet in circumference. A man in a white suit descended to the strip club floor and took his first couple of steps toward the SWAT leader and his officers. He waved his hand to the right and clenched his fist. A moment later, all 34 SWAT officers, including the leader, exploded into a giant paintball of thick golden ichor. The man bent his eyes into Iden. 7 cackled and ate a piece of candy. Chapter 1: Coming of Age. A boy was born on January 8, 2014. His mother, unfortunately, passed away after she gave birth to him. He never really knew what kind of person she really was. His father named him Iden. He was a normal kid who did normal kid things, like play with action figures, aunts and castles. He got along with other kids for the most part, but preferred solitude. On his 7th birthday, Iden played in the backyard and enjoyed the bright, sunny day. He heard a boy humming a lullaby from behind their family shed and decided to investigate. The little boy wore a black suit with black socks and black dress shoes. He was crouched as he continued to hum until Iden approached him, tapping on his shoulder. The boy was startled and jumped out of place. He promptly turned and glowered at Iden. Iden spotted one of his cat-like eyes and gasped. The boy quickly hid his face between his legs, then collected himself and looked back at Iden with bright blue eyes. "Hi," he cheered. "I've never seen you here before." Iden looked back at him with a shaky smile. Hi." The boy squinted his eyes as he grinned. "I'm Ira, but you can call me 7. It's nice to meet you." Iden examined 7 with knitted brows. I'm Iden." 7 used his hands to cover his mouth when he giggled. "All right, now that introductions are out of the way, we can play now, right?" Iden scratched his head as he pondered. Where did he come from? He shrugged it off, and they walked to his toys to play with them. Iden's father, Edward, watched him through the sliding glass door from the living room. "What a great imagination. He's pretending to have a friend." Throughout the years, Iden struggled with being normal. 7 took on the big brother role, guiding him through life when Edward was busy working on his musical career. His grades were average. His teachers did their job, but Iden was bored with the education system and didn't care as much as he should have. Iden took after his father and was very artistic. 7 took care of his bullies by pulling pranks and humiliating them. Soon enough, his classmates were too afraid to approach him out of fear of being attacked themselves. From then until Iden reached the 12th grade, he did what he wanted. But 7 still kept him on a short leash. He was a loner and an outcast. He was known as the boy who talked to himself a lot but he didn't care. He was happy with what he had. Every day, I then walked the halls with 7 and watched Griffith pick on the same kid with his bully friends. Griffith slammed the boy against his locker and laughed in his face. "Stop crying, F-word." The boy fell to his knees and wept into his hands. I then stood in front of Griffith and scowled at him. The urge to fight the overgrown bully grew stronger with each passing second. 7 pointed at Griffith with a lopsided grin. "Look at his stupid, punchable face. I then, go ahead, do something." I then turned to 7. "He probably has it rough at home," he replied. "There's probably a good reason why he's a dickhead. Let's just save the kid." Griffith turned to his friends as he pointed at Iden. "Is the R-word talking to himself again?" His friends laughed in unison. 7 let out a pronounced sigh. "Bullshit." My eyes couldn't roll any farther into my head. I then looked back at Griffith and scratched the back of his head. 7 pointed at Griffith's face. "That doesn't mean shit. This high school puke deserves to get his face beaten. Do it. Do it." I then shook his head and took a step back from the bully looming over him. 7's face turned scarlet red. The heat that emanated from his body peeled the skin off his forehead. He locked eyes with Iden, exposing his hypnotic, demonic face. "Do it. Help the boy, Iden. Go ahead. Fuck up that bully, Iden. Do it, Iden." Iden squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head before charging at Griffith in a blind rage. 7 watched as Iden fed into his emotions with a sinister grin. He opened the palms of his hands and aimed them toward Iden. Mysterious scarlet-red clouds of magic coated Iden's hands. Iden pushed the group of bullies aside and repeatedly threw his fists into Griffith's torso. "Ah!" Griffith cried out. "Arg, Adaji." He caught a glimpse of Iden's blood-red eyes before flying into the locker behind him. Griffith leaned on the imprint in the locker and screamed in terror. Iden took a deep breath and stepped back. He closed his eyes and shook his head. When he reopened them, he found himself in a hallway full of kids who stared at him. Griffith collapsed onto the floor and pointed his finger at Iden's face. "You're a freak," he shouted. "You're a fucking freak," and struggled to get up before he wrapped an arm around his friend's neck. Stumbling down the hall, an African boy with a short buzz cut and green eyes approached Iden and touched his arm. "You saved me. My name's Charlie. Thank you," he said, followed by a gentle hug. When Charlie let go, he examined Iden with narrowed brows. "How'd you save me? Did someone put you up to this? Do you want money?" Iden occasionally shifted his eyes from the left to right side of his vision. "Well, it looked like they were giving you a hard time. I felt bad." 7 stood next to Charlie as he glared at Iden. "Bullshit, Iden. I had to force you. You're still too soft. I gave you the strength you needed," he cackled. Iden glanced at 7 with knitted brows. "Fuck off." Charlie flinched and slightly curled his body. "Did I do something wrong? Do you want me to leave?" Iden shook his head. "No, it's fine. My name is Iden. I don't really have friends at Forest High." Charlie nodded and pointed at him with the inside corners of his brows lifted. "Yeah, you're the one who talks to himself, huh?" Iden cleared his throat and stared at the ground. "No, I don't." 7 leaned against the locker next to them and chortled while he ate candy from his brown paper bag. "Iden, when we're talking, you look like you're off your tits." Iden glanced at 7 and silently told him to fuck off. Charlie turned his head to see where Iden looked and only saw the set of lockers, then offered Iden a handshake with a warm smile. "Okay, I don't know who you're talking to, but let's go to my house. My mom is making macaroni." They shook hands and left school. 7 followed them while eating his beloved candy. Iden's leg vibrated. Grabbing the phone from his pocket, he checked the message. It read, "Dad, I got a call from your principal. We need to talk when you get home." 7 hovered over Iden's shoulder with a grin on his face. "I got you into some shit, didn't I?" he chuckled. Aiden turned to him and shrugged his shoulders. Charlie led Aiden and Seven to his house, and the three of them went inside. Charlie took his shoes off and walked to his room. Aiden and Seven quietly followed behind him. Charlie made his way to his desk chair and sat down. "You into music?" Aiden walked over to Charlie's bed and made himself comfortable. "My dad is a music producer. I love music." Charlie's face lit up. "Good, you are cooler than I thought." Aiden stared at him with a blank face. "I don't give a fuck what you think of me," he thought. Seven leaned against the bedroom door and laughed hysterically. Charlie used his laptop and filed through his playlist of music before choosing a song and pressing play. Charlie got out of his seat and started dancing. Aiden rubbed his jaw, looking at Seven with a shaky smile. Seven raised a brow and ate his candy. Charlie walked over to his desk chair and sat down, then leaned toward his laptop and played another song. Aiden relaxed his shoulders and leaned back on the bed. Charlie leaned on his chair as he looked at Aiden. "So, what kind of music do you listen to?" Aiden turned his head, looking back at him. "I'm into whatever speaks to me." "This is nice." Charlie nodded and stared at the ceiling. "Cool, cool. I like listening to this stuff when I need to feel something." "Anything?" Seven cackled. "What a snowflake." Aiden glared at Seven and shook his head. Charlie's mum opened the door. It went through Seven's body as if he were a ghost. She carried cups of coffee on a tray and placed them on Charlie's desk. Charlie glanced at the coffee and turned to his mother. "Mom, stop. You're embarrassing me." She looked at him with a warm smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, baby," she said with an Acadian accent. Aiden looked at Charlie's mother with a smirk. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Charlie. It smells great." She laughed and nodded on her way out of the room. Seven leaned against the wall once the door closed and ate a piece of his candy. Charlie turned to his laptop as he took a sip from his cup, then played another song. Charlie placed his cup on the desk and turned to Aiden. "So, do you like electronic dance music?" Aiden nodded and sipped his coffee. "Yeah, EDM is all right." Seven bobbed his head as he picked out a piece of candy. Aiden saw him and smirked. "I wouldn't have thought you were into something like this." Charlie leaned forward with a cold stare. "What? Is it because I'm black? I don't look like I'd listen to this. Is my skin is too dark for this kind of music?" Sweat beaded at the top of Aiden's face. Charlie slapped his knee and cackled. "I'm just fucking with you. I'm into all kinds of stuff. It plays a huge part in my life. Music brings me peace of mind, or it helps with getting my rage out. It definitely gets me through rough patches. Music is huge for me." Aiden took another sip of coffee and placed the cup on his lap. "If you could give me a playlist, that'd be great." Charlie turned to his laptop with a grin on his face. "You got it, handsome. You rescued me from those sour asses. It's the least I can do." They hung out for hours, shared music and other interests. Later that night, Aiden ate macaroni and cheese with Charlie and his mom. After dinner, Aiden walked home with Seven. Once he made it home, he walked through the front door to find his father, Edward, watching television in his favorite chair. "Aiden, you're finally home." Edward waved to Aiden, beckoning him. "I need to talk to you about school today. Do me a favor and sit down." Aiden made his way to the couch across from Edward and sat down. "What's this I heard from school?" Edward asked. "You're beating kids up now." "It was a bully, Dad," Aiden replied. Edward squinted his eyes. Aiden glanced at the floor by his feet before looking back at his father. "He and his friends were beating on my friend, Charlie. I had to do something." Edward took a deep breath. "Why, you have a friend. That's great," he cheered. "You're a good kid for helping your friend. I'm proud of you for stepping in and being a hero. But you can't solve things with violence, son. You need to tell a teacher or your principal. If you continue to fight, it might grow into something bad and get worse. You're a good kid, you're better than that." He got out of his chair and knelt next to Iden, then took his necklace off and handed it to him. Here, wear this. If you feel like you want to act out, look at this necklace and remember what I told you. Iden looked down at the necklace as he held it in his hand. He opened the pendant and saw a picture of his parents smiling at each other, then closed it and decided to never take it off from that day forward. The next day, Iden and Charlie sat in English class with their belongings. Mrs. Myers finished her lesson. Okay class, remember to take pride in your work. Believe in yourself, she said as she winked at Seven. Iden was oblivious, not noticing a thing. Seven ate a piece of candy and winked back at her. Moments later, the school bell rang. All of the kids stood out of their chairs and raced out of the classroom. All right class, don't forget what I said, Mrs. Myers shouted. Griffith, I need to speak with you before you leave. Lunchtime came around. Iden and Charlie made a shortcut across the schoolyard to reach the other side. Yo Iden, there's this sick app that lets a group of friends listen to the same thing at once. I'll hook it up for you. Iden nodded as he took his phone out of his pocket. Sweet, thanks, dude. I didn't know something this cool existed. Charlie wore a lopsided grin while he set up the app on Iden's phone. You already know I got the hookup. The boy I've been eyeing is over there. I'm gonna go talk to him. Iden nodded and grabbed his phone, then stepped aside and paved the way with a hand gesture. Sure, go for it. Charlie promptly left Iden by himself. Iden chose a random bench table and sat down to eat his food. Griffith pointed at him with a fiery glare. You? Iden's head shot up. The overgrown bully and his friends stood behind him, staring at the back of his head. Get the fuck up, F-word lover, Griffith shouted. You hit me with a cheap shot. Shit ass. Sitting on the table next to Iden, Seven shook the bottom of his paper bag before he picked out a piece of candy. This Griffith kid is fucking annoying, huh? Griffith and his band of bullies grabbed Iden and threw him onto his back. Iden wheezed, losing his breath. With all of his rage, Griffith clenched his jaw and kicked Iden in the stomach. You got lucky, F-word lover. Do you love him? Are you F-word too? Griffith's friends laughed and took a turn to kick him. Seven stood onto his feet and circled them with an ominous grin. Are you going to let those hose heads beat on you? I can't, Iden replied. There's too many of them. Seven looked up at the sky and cackled. These losers are nothing. You can be the strongest kid in school. No one would fuck with you or your friends. Don't you want that? Fight back. Fuck them up. They are tiny, little ants compared to you. Iden laid on the ground, enduring each landing kick. Do it, Seven shouted. Iden's demonic eyes bulged out of his head. Extreme heat emanated from his entire body. A kid with a portable yellow fang speaker stood next to them as he watched the fight. Seven closely examined Iden while he ate his beloved candy. Scarlet red magic shrouded Iden's hands. Seven's ruby red irises brought out his pearly white teeth. You'll be the dragon before you know it, kiddo. Iden grabbed a kid's leg and kicked him. The bully cried out as he fell onto the ground. He looked at the bone that popped out of his leg and screamed. Seven held his stomach as he cackled at the sky. Delicious. With moist eyes and knitted brows, Griffith stared at his injured friend. Come on, he shouted as he pushed another bully forward. Hit him, you pussies. Iden pushed himself onto his feet. A bully stepped toward him and cranked his arm back. Iden turned to the bully and punched him in the throat. The bully dropped to his knees as he wheezed. A cold sweat beaded down Griffith's face. He quivered as he scowled at Iden. Seven continued to circle them with a beaming grin. See how much of a loser he is. You could be much greater than this pile of filth. Everyone would look up to you. Your strength could be unmatched. Griffith ground his teeth. I'm tired of your shit. Iden promptly turned to him and readied himself. Griffith took a deep breath and charged toward him, but was swiftly taken down by a heavy dropkick. Griffith fell flat on his back, then slowly leaned to the left side of his body, gasping for air. Throwing a series of punches, I then beat him to a bloody pulp, while he laid unresponsive on the cement. The school kids who surrounded them watched in terror. Lost in his lust for violence, I then ceaselessly punished his overgrown foe. Griffith choked on his own blood. "Stop," he murmured. I then stopped and stared at him before getting onto his feet. Griffith turned onto his hands and knees and spat out a mouthful of blood. He aimlessly crawled away while he tried to hold back his chronic cough. I then clenched his fists as he glared at the back of his head. Looking at his terrified peers, he stepped back and relaxed his shoulders. Seven sat at the table next to him, chortling. "Why did I do that?" I then thought. "What's happening to me?" Seven popped a piece of candy into his mouth. "You are letting me help you." I then felt the warmth of a mysterious presence loosen its grip and fade away. As he took a deep breath, the red clouds around his hands vanished. The surrounding kids gaped at the sight of him. A red-headed girl watched from behind the crowd. Seeing the fight had finished, she slid her phone into her pocket and walked away. Later that day, I then was called to the principal's office to speak with Mr. Heather. I then, "You know why you are here, right?" Mr. Heather asked. I then stared at him with pinched lips. "You did great out there," Mr. Heather said, folding his hands on his desk. "Griffith was a little shit, but you're going to have to stay home for a couple of days, just so his family feels like you got some form of punishment from it." I then looked at the ceiling as he scratched his head. "What the fuck?" he thought. Mr. Heather leaned forward with knitted brows. "You believed that all you needed was yourself, and no one else, believing that you alone could change things around here. Griffith has picked on kids for a while now. Smaller, younger kids. He's a pussy. Hopefully, things will change now. I'm proud of you, son." I then turned to Seven with a raised eyebrow. His face was buried in his bag of candy. "I'll be calling your father after our chat and inform him about this little episode," Mr. Heather said as he filed through his paperwork. "You're dismissed." I then shot out of the chair and ambled out of the office. Mr. Heather and Seven winked at each other without Haydn's acknowledgement. On his walk home, I then remembered Edward's work schedule and knew he wouldn't be home for an hour or so. If I run fast enough, I can delete the message and make it look like nothing happened, he thought. I then perked up and sprinted the rest of the way home. He took every alleyway and side road he knew of, ignoring street signs, racing through traffic, and stopping at nothing to get home before his father. I'd rather get hit by a car over dad bitching at me. I really hope he has some extra shit to do. Fuck, shit, fuck. He finally made it home and walked through the front door. Looming over the house phone, he saw a flashing light and pressed every button on the machine as fast as he could. Mr. Heather's voice came through the speakers, and I then immediately deleted it. Then walked upstairs to his room and pretended as if nothing happened, pulling his homework out of his bag and placing it on his desk. I then took a deep breath and relaxed his shoulders. 19 minutes later, Edward walked through the front door and made his way to Haydn's room. For the sake of Haydn's privacy, he knocked twice and cracked the door open. "Son, are you home?" I then raised his head and looked over his shoulder. "Yay, Dad, just doing homework." Edward opened the ajar door a little more and took a step inside. "You have a good day at school?" I then nodded while staring at his homework. Yeah, it was a learning experience." Edward smirked and grabbed the doorknob. "I'll have dinner ready by 6 and knock on the wall when it's done." I then threw his index and middle finger into the air. "Sounds good, Dad, I'm starving." Edward nodded and closed the door behind him. I then let out a sigh of relief and continued his homework. Seven sat on Haydn's bed, leaning against the headboard as he ate candy out of his brown paper bag. "We're free, Haydn," He chuckled. We own the school now. I then turned to him with narrowed brows. I don't want to own the school. I just want to be a kid. I already miss video games. 7 dropped his bag of candy and pointed at him. Bullshit. You loved it when you towered over that troglodyte. You beat the shit out of those kids. Well, it felt nice beating up Griffith. I then replied. It made me feel like superb guy from the comic book. Like I could lift cars off the ground or blow up a basketball with my eyes. Like an expensive drug. 7 cackled. Definitely an upper. I then looked down at his hands, examining them. I feel kind of good now. Hurting them felt invigorating. 7 stared at him with an overjoyed gleam. Hey Mikey, I think he likes it. I then looked back at him with a blank face. You are a god to your peers from now on, 7 said. You realize that, right? God already lives in all of us. I then replied. It helps people thrive. 7 asked. God's gender is irrelevant. I then explained. Our vision of God exists in all of us, I believe, to help us feel safe and comfortable. With fire in 7's eyes, he glared at Iden and pushed himself off the bed. A cloud of extremely hot steam emanated off his body. His innocent-looking, boy-like frame morphed into a hulking beast-like demon who loomed over Iden. The head of a ferocious wolf and leathery raven black skin brought out his blood-red eyes. 7 locked eyes with Iden and effortlessly hypnotized him. Bullshit, he shouted. God doesn't exist. God is a placebo for the weak and broken, the fallen, angry, lazy, hypocrites who blame others, but never stare down the fucking barrel themselves. The ones who always have fucking excuses. The ones who always think they are right. The ones who blindly believe in some fairy tale. There never was a God. God is a mascot for the ignorant who act like sheep and blindly follow. You don't need God. You are God. Everyone will need you. I knight thee, the keeper of wrath. I then fell on his back and stared at the ceiling with his eyes slowly rolling into the back of his head. 7 leaned toward him and blew a mysterious red cloud in his face. I then let out a series of coughs and turned onto his hands and knees. His chronic cough forced him to dry heave on the wooden floor. Holding his chest and throat, he gasped for a breath of fresh air. Suddenly, something tossed and turned in his throat, bumping and scratching as it fought to get out. I then grabbed his neck with both hands, desperately trying to stop whatever it was from getting out. The mysterious entity suddenly ceased. I then took a deep breath and relaxed his body. Moments later, a stream of blood launched out of his mouth, spraying the bedroom floor. 7 whispered an incantation from an ancient foreign language as he watched with a blinding grin. Aiden's blood flooded the floor, submerging his hands. Gasping for air, he struggled to pick himself up. The blood on the floor glued him to it. In one fell swoop, a massive black claw lacerated its way out of his mouth and dug its way back inside. 6 more liters of blood immediately poured out of his mouth, submerging more of his body. Edward knocked on the door and walked into the room. Are you okay, buddy? I then turned to his father and looked back at his hands. Every drop of blood was gone. He suddenly had a full range of motion. I then squinted his eyes and examined the room with an unfocused gaze, then turned at Edward and nodded. Edward raised his right brow as he examined the room and nodded before he closed the door. I then frantically checked his surroundings. He tried to find any trace of blood in the hope of finding a drop of evidence to prove he wasn't crazy. 7 walked out of the shadowy corner, morphing back into a human. After leaning against the headboard of Aiden's bed, he popped a piece of candy into his mouth. You okay, kiddo? I then ran his hands through his hair. 7 lent his hand to him. You passed out for a while, he said. Looked like a lucid dream. I then swatted 7's hand away and reached for his chair. What the fuck did you do to me, 7? 7 briefly raised his shoulders and shook his head. I don't. I then raised his hand pointing at him. What the fuck did you do to me? 7 licked his hand and combed his hair back with his fingers. I'm giving you the tools you need to survive. That's it. That's all. Aiden sat in his desk chair and moved away from the bed. Are you some kind of monster? 7 stared at Aiden with half-lidded eyes and a dimpled smile. A monster? Pish posh. I'm a guide who has seen your story a million times over. From the day you were born until the day you die, I've seen it all. I'm here to help you get to endgame. Aiden squinted his eyes. What kind of endgame? Saving the world, kiddo. 7 replied as he gently placed his hands on his lap. Ridding the world of evil. I first wanted you as one of my professionals, but I've changed my mind. You're meant for something greater. Aiden's face lit up. What do you mean by professional? 7 chuckled. You'll find out in the Nexus. Aiden raised a brow. What? 7 shook the bottom of his candy bag and popped a piece into his mouth. You've already accepted my gift. You are of my blood forevermore. Aiden froze. Wait, what? Forever? 7 cackled and ate another piece of candy. In other words, no givesies backsies. Aiden leaned forward, holding his face. This is fucking crazy. This is for the best, 7 said gleefully. Just embrace and accept this gift into your heart. Trust in yourself, believe in yourself, and you will win the holy war. You shouldn't be afraid of me. We're not foes. We're family now, or at the very least, that skinny guy with a fat friend. A man can never run from his fate or from the crimes of his past. Remember that, kiddo. Aiden stared at the ceiling as he scratched his head. Holy war. 7 grinned like a Cheshire cat. You're not ready yet, he said, hanging upside down from the ceiling. Get some sleep. You've been through a lot today. Aiden collapsed onto his bed and immediately passed out. For hours, 7 levitated in the lotus position at the end of Aiden's bed. His glowing, bright red eyes glared at Aiden without a single blink as he whispered an incantation. The next morning, Edward knocked on Aiden's bedroom door twice and stepped inside. Aiden, wake up, buddy. He sat on the bed next to Aiden and gently rocked his shoulder back and forth. Aiden scrunched his face as he rubbed his eyes. Dad. Yes, son, Edward replied. I got a call from Griffith's parents. Do you know anything about that? Aiden pushed himself up with his elbows. He picked on me and my friends, so I beat the shit out of him. He doesn't have the balls to pick on kids anymore. I'm the new god at school. 7 lowered his bag of candy and watched with a shinning smile. Edward knitted his brows. Son, it's great that you want to protect your friends. It's heartwarming. But no one is above God. It's sinful to think that way. Think about modest behavior, selflessness, and giving respect to each other, giving credit where credit is due, and not unfairly glorifying one's own self. That is the ticket. Aiden, please remember and take that with you. That being said, it's good that you're taking care of your friends. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for. 7 rolled his eyes and popped a piece of candy into his mouth. Who the fuck is this guy? Saint Michael. Aiden glanced at 7 and turned to Edward. I understand. I get what you are telling me. Thanks, Dad. Edward patted Aiden's chest as he nodded. Anytime, son. I'm always here for you. I love you. I love you too, Dad, Aiden replied. Edward nodded once more and walked out of the room. 7 stared at them with knitted eyebrows. Disgusting humans. He dropped from the ceiling and ate a piece of candy. Aiden, people don't want a hero. They want to eat cheeseburgers, play the lotto, and watch television. Aiden yawned and rolled to the opposite side of his bed. I don't have to worry about school today. Let me sleep. A few days had passed. Aiden walked down the halls of Forest High with Charlie. The kids in the hall stared as they whispered to one another. Charlie listened to music with his yellow fang speaker. Welcome back to hell, Aiden. You were deeply missed. Aiden glanced at each girl, receiving a coy smile in return. Thanks, Dude, I missed being here. 7 closely followed behind them, rolling his eyes. Fucking humans. The school bell rang, and everyone dotted for their classrooms. Aiden and Charlie waited and walked in after everyone else. Their teacher walked from her desk and faced the class. Hello class, I'll be your substitute teacher for the foreseeable future. My name is Mrs. Atkins. She turned toward the chalkboard and wrote her name on it. The boys in the class were drooling over themselves in awe of the new teacher and her backside. 7 sat in the corner of the classroom, laughing to himself. Delicious, he whispered as he ate a piece of candy. Mrs. Atkins turned to the class once again. I'll be teaching sexual education. The face of every boy in the room lit up. Sexual education takes various dimensions of human experience into account, and we'll be covering a variety of subjects, Mrs. Atkins explained as she made notes on the chalkboard. Knowledge of the body, body image, gender stereotypes, and romantic feelings. Aiden leaned next to Charlie and tapped him on the shoulder. Dude, she's so hot. If I were into boobies, I'd call dibs, Charlie replied. Mrs. Atkins finished making notes and turned to the class. Some teachers would say that abstinence is the way to go, but that's harmful, she explained. The provinces with the highest rates of teen moms aged 15 to 19 were also those provinces where abstinence-only programs were encouraged and where comprehensive sex education, including information on contraception, was not part of the school curriculum. So, for the boys, if you get backed up, masturbation isn't a bad thing. It's easy to be safe. Just rub one out daily, get it out of your system. Yes, ma'am, a student shouted. The rest of the boys laughed. Aiden, a voice whispered. We've bumped into our first deleted adult scene. Thanks, YouTube. Now, on to the next scene. Aiden's eyes rolled into the back of his head before he leaned backward and fell out of his chair. All of his classmates turned to him and gasped. Mrs. Atkins stood by the chalkboard, fully clothed, looking at him with a raised eyebrow. Mr. Newbold, are you okay? Charlie raised his hand on his way to Aiden. Can Aiden and I be excused, Mrs. Atkins? She smirked and nodded. Of course, take your time. Aiden rubbed the back of his head and held on to Charlie while he stood up. They slowly collected themselves and walked out of the classroom. 7 closely followed them as he gave Mrs. Atkins a wink on his way out. She smirked and gave 7 a wink in return. Charlie turned to Aiden, patting him on the back. Dude, are you okay? Aiden touched his crotch. There's a wet spot. I think I jizzed my pants. Charlie stopped walking and let go of him. Ha 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 ha. Holy shit. That's fucking rich. Ha 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 ha. Aiden touched his crotch once more. It's so gross. Okay, how about I drive you to your place? Yeah, Charlie said with the inside corners of his brows lifted. You get a fresh pair of boxers, and we come back to school. Yeah, that sounds great. I need new pants, Aiden replied. They walked out of the foyer and made their way across the yard toward the sidewalk at the front end of the school. Charlie turned to him with a smirk. So, what happened? How'd you manage to fall out of your chair and splooge your pants? Or was falling on your big head the thing that did it? Aiden hung his head as he scratched the back of it. Well, it was almost like a daydream, he said as he saw something. I felt like I couldn't. He stopped everything he was doing to focus on what he saw. Charlie stared at Aiden and looked where he was looking. Couldn't what? Aiden stared at a red-headed girl, pointing at her. Who's that? Charlie giggled as he turned to Aiden. That's Megan Reed, one of the most popular girls at school. Aiden stared at her with an unbreakable gaze. She's looking right at me. Charlie, what do I do? Charlie raised his hands. Oh, I got it. Quick, splooge your pants again. Aiden promptly gave him a sour look. Megan locked eyes with Aiden as she approached them. Hey, You're Iden, you bold, right? You were the one who kicked the shit out of Griffith Ross. Iden stared at his shoes. Yeah, that was me. Megan placed her hands on her hips. Griffith was my boyfriend. Charlie gaped at Iden. Oh, well, Iden mumbled, scrambling for a coherent sentence. Megan interrupted him, handing over a piece of paper with her phone number written on it. He was a fucking asshole. Thank you. Here's my number. Call me. Sure. Yeah, you betcha, Iden replied. Megan smirked as she looked at the ground, then nodded and excused herself from the two of them. I'm Charlie Scott, Charlie shouted as he waved. Nice to meet you too. Iden watched her leave with a cherry red face. I can totally tell, dude. She wants to fuck me, Charlie said, leaning into Iden. It's too bad that I'm not into pink tacos. Stupid, Iden said, smacking his forehead with the palm of his hand. I'm so stupid. He relaxed his shoulders and turned to Charlie. Hey, Charlie. Charlie turned to him. Yeah. Iden walked toward Charlie's car. I still have jizz in my pants. Take me home. Charlie pulled up next to the curb in front of Iden's house and parked the car. On his way inside, Iden spotted his father's car in the driveway. He walked through the front door and was welcomed by the smell of Edward's homemade spaghetti soup. Iden, what are you doing at home? Edward asked. It's lunchtime. Are you in trouble again? Iden took his shoes off and walked into the living room. I'm in a bad spot, but it's not what you think. Charlie and I had a sexual education class. I was daydreaming, but it felt so real. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground and needed new pants. Charlie helped me up and drove me home to get changed. Edward laughed and ate a spoonful of his soup. Iden raced to his room to get changed. Edward laughed once again. Seven leaned against the headboard of Iden's bed and ate candy from his brown paper bag. It felt good, didn't it, kiddo? Iden filed through his dresser, searching for clean underwear. What did? Seven leaned forward. Her P-word, the warmth of a woman. Iden squinted his eyes as he turned to Seven with knitted brows. It felt so real. I thought it was actually happening to me. How did everyone vanish and reappear? How did she undress so quickly? Seven cackled. Just imagine, Iden, the power you'll wield. You can have all the P-word you can handle. Trust me, you can't handle that teacher of yours. Iden turned to his dresser and looked for clean underwear. The only girl I want is Megan. Seven dropped his bag of candy on the bed and glared at him. Bullshit, he shouted. You saw Samantha naked with her P-word lips on your lap. Didn't you like it? You want more, don't you? Pornographic images of Mrs. Atkins flooded Iden's mind. He closed his eyes and wiped the drool off the corner of his mouth. She's amazing, he whispered. What a woman. Seven grabbed his bag of candy as he grinned with glee. Yes, of course she is. Iden changed clothes and went downstairs. Dad, can I talk to you? Edward leaned on his careless dude chair, watching television with a bowl of soup next to him. Of course. What's going on? Iden ambled to the couch across from him and sat down. I really like this girl and… Edward promptly interrupted him. I know where this is going. It's okay. Don't fall into lust, son. Insatiable needs for sex or things of that nature. Thoughts, desires, and actions are all normal. That being said, lean toward courage and boldness. Embrace moral wholesomeness and achieve purity of thought through education and betterment. From my experience, that will be the ultimate key. You will be happier in the long run. Women are a thing to be nurtured, not a thing to be conquered. You're a smart kid. Remember what I've told you, son. Iden nodded and looked at the floor. Right, you made this a lot less awkward than I thought. Edward smirked and continued watching television. Well, I've been there before. I wish I had the knowledge I have now, back when I was your age. Now go back to school. Iden grabbed his backpack and walked to Charlie's car. He nodded to Charlie, and they drove back to school. The school bell rang at the end of the day, and all of the kids bottlenecked out of the school's front entrance. Aiden and Charlie walked out and hopped into his car. Charlie turned the car on with music playing out of the speakers. "Hey!" Griffith shouted. "Stink face!" He quickly made his way to the car before Charlie could pull out of the parking spot. Charlie turned his head and waved at him. "Hey, dickhead!" Griffith squinted his eyes as he knitted his brows. "Shut up, fuck-ass. Listen, I've rented a place for this party I'm having. You should come, Aiden. Both of you should." Aiden and Charlie looked at each other and grimaced. Griffith handed Charlie a piece of paper with an address on it. "I'll leave you to it. Sorry about what happened, boys. I'm a fucking idiot," he said, tapping the roof of the car twice before walking away. Charlie looked at the piece of paper before showing it to Aiden. "I don't know what to think of this," Aiden said. "It could be fun. Who knows?" Charlie replied. Aiden pulled his phone out and texted Megan, "Are you going to Griffith's party?" He immediately received a message back, "I'll see you there," followed by a winking emoji. Aiden quickly felt wet in all of the wrong places. "Oh fuck." Charlie turned to him. "What?" "She's going," Aiden replied. "Oh fuck. Oh shit. What do I do?" Charlie opened his palms and raised them upward. "I don't know. I'm not into P-word. I took the easy route." Aiden looked out of the passenger window. "Fuck, okay. Okay, I'll figure something out." A few days later, the weekend rolled around. It was the day of Griffith's party. Aiden sat in his desk chair and stared at the ceiling. Seven leaned against the headboard of the bed as he ate candy from his brown paper bag. "Are you ready for that circus of freaks?" Aiden shot out of his chair, pacing around the room. "Of course I am, Seven. She's going to be there." Seven cackled. "Just don't blow your load, champ." Aiden received a text message. "Changing now. Be there soon. See." His stress level got the best of him, making his skin feel tingly and itchy. "All of this is giving me anxiety shits." Seven tossed his bag into the air as he laughed hysterically. "I'm never going to forget tonight." Aiden knitted his brows as he stared at the floor. "I've never been to a party before." Seven smirked as he reached around the bed for his bag of candy. "Yeah, no shit. I've watched your entire life break a leg." Aiden pulled his phone out and texted Charlie, "I'm really nervous. What if I jizz my pants again?" A few minutes later, he received another message. "Just rub one out now and get it out of your system." Charlie replied, "I do that, and it's been a pretty good life hack." A few hours later, Charlie picked Aiden up with his car, and they drove to Griffith's party. Once they arrived, they were awestruck after seeing the house. "Dude, where does he get the money to party in a fucking mansion?" Aiden asked. "It looks like 3 houses that are glued together." Charlie frantically looked around the property. "Where the fuck do I park?" Aiden pointed to a sign with an arrow on it. "Parking" was written underneath it. Charlie followed the driveway into a giant parking lot behind the house. "There has to be like 50 cars here." Aiden spotted many different kinds of sports cars and luxury vehicles. "What kind of a party is this?" Charlie parked the car and they walked to the front door. Aiden rang the doorbell and they were immediately greeted by the house butler who invited them inside. Party music blared out of the stereo system of the massive house. "Aiden," Griffith shouted, "you made it." After approaching the pair, he turned to Charlie. "Ass vomit, you're here." Charlie turned to him with broadened eyes as he slid his hands into his back pant pockets. "Shit breath, I'm here." Griffith dotted a glance between the pair. "Aiden, ass vomit, make yourselves at home. If you need anything, ask the butler. There's tons of food everywhere, drinks everywhere. There's a pool in the backyard if you want to go for a dip." He quickly grinned like a Cheshire cat. "If you want any drugs, come grab me." Aiden and Charlie looked at each other with a blank face, then proceeded to nod at the overgrown bully. Griffith turned around and disappeared into the sea of party-goers. "It looks like every kid from school is here," Charlie said. What the fuck are adults doing here? There are teenagers and drugs everywhere. What the fuck? I then examined the older group of men and women. They look like they belong on Wall Street. Something doesn't feel right. Charlie turned to Aiden and rested his hand on his shoulder. You're just anxious because you're at your first party. I mean, I am too. But we're here together. Take a deep breath and you'll be fine. Aiden nodded and relaxed his shoulders. Yeah, you're right. Charlie, look, he shouted, pointing at her. It's Mrs. Atkins. He and Charlie froze as they gaped at her from across the room. Mrs. Atkins saw Aiden in her peripheral vision and locked him into her seductive gaze. She winked and disappeared into the sea of people. Aiden and Charlie quickly collected themselves and pretended to be influential people. All right, Aiden, I'm officially uncomfortable, Charlie said. Aiden nodded as he examined the crowd of people. Yeah, I'm getting a drink. You want one? Yeah, Charlie replied as he walked away. I'm gonna check out the pool. I'll meet you there. Aiden walked through the crowd of people and made his way to the kitchen where he found the assortment of refreshments. He grabbed a drink for Charlie and himself, then made his way toward the backyard entrance of the house. Suddenly, a man who wore a white suit with well-kept hair appeared. A new song played out of the speakers of the house. Aiden felt as if he had seen this man before, perhaps in a dream or previous life. He stared into the man's amber-colored eyes as they crossed paths. It was a characteristic that resonated with him. The man turned to him with a broad smile. Aiden's face lit up. You must be Aiden, the man said. Griffith has told me a lot about you. His elegant composure felt warm and relaxing. Now, I know what you did, but it is all in the past. Let bygones be bygones, am I right? Without further ado, my name is Levi. You can call me Mr. Ross if you'd like. Aiden smirked as he scratched his head. I beat the fuck out of his kid, he thought. Why would he just shrug that off? Soon after, he met eyes with Levi. It's nice to meet you, sir, he replied. Levi chuckled and bowed to him. You called me sir, charming. Let me show you around, he said, using various hand gestures to guide Aiden throughout the mansion. That's the door to the pool in the backyard. Here is the wine cellar. They traversed the house and examined a feature that was built in the basement. Have you noticed how the ceiling looks like a river, Mr. Newbold? Levi asked. Behind this glass door is a mini waterfall. If I turn it on, the cool air shoots out of the basement and floods the entire house. Brilliant architecture. Yeah, Mr. Ross, Aiden replied. This is a very impressive home you've got here. Levi smirked with half-lidded eyes. Mr. Newbold, I have some business waiting for me. It was nice meeting you, sir. If you don't mind, I'd enjoy another chat with you later this evening. Don't worry, I'll find you. Sure thing, Mr. Ross, Aiden replied. Levi nodded and disappeared into another room. Aiden looked down at the drinks in his hands and remembered Charlie had been waiting on him, then quickly backtracked and found his way to the pool area. A new song played out of the house speakers. He frantically looked everywhere, but couldn't find Charlie. Aiden, Megan shouted. She wore a buckle micro bikini top with jean shorts. Aiden couldn't help but stare at the exposed parts of her body, bearing her tasteful tattoos. Holy shit, she's so hot. Aiden thought, what is something that doesn't arouse me? Old people covered in mayonnaise. Old people covered in mayonnaise. Megan gazed into his eyes. Hey Aiden, it's good to see you. Oh hey, Megan. Aiden replied. It's surprising seeing you here. Megan raised a brow. I texted you, saying I was coming, remember? Oh yeah, right, Aiden replied. Seven cackled and ate a piece of candy as he walked by. Don't come in your pants, kiddo. Aiden rubbed his brows with his index finger and thumb. Stupid, he thought. I'm so fucking stupid. Megan stared at him as she cleared her throat. Anyways, close your eyes and open your mouth. Aiden promptly followed her instructions. Megan placed a pill into his mouth with flamethrower whiskey and gave him a passionate kiss. Aiden swallowed the pill and mouthful of liquor and violently coughed. What the fuck was that? It's just MDMA and some booze, Megan explained. Have you not done MDMA before? A little alcohol. Yeah, he replied, narrowing his brows. Of course I have, Seven guffawed as he watched. You're in for a fucking ride. Megan leaned in, kissing him on the cheek. Babe, you've never done it before. Aiden promptly avoided eye contact. I have to go grab something, Megan said with a gentle smile. I'll come back and help you, okay? Aiden smiled back as he nodded. Megan walked inside the mansion and disappeared into the crowd of people. Holy shit, Aiden thought, running his fingers through his hair. She kissed me. She called me a pet name, Seven shouted as he popped a piece of candy into his mouth. She basically gave you the premium pass to the Taco Express. What the fuck are you doing? Aiden heard Levi speak as if his voice was inside his head. Aiden, I finally found you. He turned and Levi was but a few feet from him. Mr. Ross, Aiden said, do you need me for something? Levi nodded. Follow me. I have little time to spare. They walked into the massive home, finding men and women who wore business attire and conversed with refreshments in hand. Their vernacular was something Aiden had never heard in his entire life. They were far too absorbed in their own business party to notice the drunk kids who were high on numerous narcotics. Levi and Aiden eventually made their way to an empty bedroom. Aiden stepped inside, and Levi closed the door behind them. All right, Seven, come out. Aiden's eyes popped out of his head. How does he know about Seven? He thought. Can he see him? Can he hear him? Did I say something? What the fuck? Seven, Levi shouted. Stop hiding. Seven dropped from the ceiling. Ugh, he screamed. What the fuck do you want? Nvidia. Aiden turned to Seven with narrowed brows. Streams of sweat trickled down his back. I want little Aiden here to grow up, Satan, Levi said. Aiden felt his stomach turn. Satan, there's a tremendous amount of information you're not aware of, Mr. Newbold, Levi replied. I'm tired of Seven taking his time with you. It's not fair to the rest of us. He turned to Seven with a blank face. So, will you explain to the boy, or will I, Ira? Seven morphed into his true demon form, glaring at Levi with his protruding, blood-red eyes. He's not ready. He roared. Let him enjoy life first. Aiden dotted a glance between the pair. He knows your name, Levi said. We can't go back now. Cut the shit, brother. Bullshit, Seven screamed. Levi kept his composure as he turned to Aiden. Mr. Newbold, did Ira, sorry, Seven not mention he was one of the 7 gods of hell? He's the only one who stays hidden from the world. He looks like a caitiff deity to me. Shut the fuck up, Seven screamed. I'm doing this for the boy. Levi pointed at Seven with his index and middle finger. Listen, I knew the very moment you blooded him in, Ira. That ripple echoed through all of us. I've seen the endings, and you've been too fucking lazy to look at them yourself. Pull your big boy pants up. It's clear that he has to find out right now. Fuck you, Leviathan, Seven shouted. Fine, it sounds like you're the boy's father, Levi said. Quit the shit, Ira. Seven glanced at the shaking boy. What's wrong with you? Snap out of it, short fuse. Aiden stared at the 2 demons, lost in a train of thought. He filed through his childhood, looking back for any evidence of Seven being a monster. Aiden, Nvidia, you fucking broke the kid, Seven shouted. Fix him now. Aiden came back to his senses and looked at Seven with the inside corners of his brows raised. Yes, I'll explain, Ira, Levi said. You sit there like a good dog. Seven snarled as he morphed back into a human. Levi's head slowly began to change. 4 glowing golden eyes pierced into Aiden's soul with the head of a terrifying serpent, bearing jagged teeth. Iden was paralyzed at the sight of his unworldly transformation. We are a council of very powerful demons, Iden, Levi explained. We are the keepers of hell. Yes, Iden, angels and demons are real. A new song played through the house speakers. Iden dotted a glance between Levi and Seven. Seven opened the palm of his right hand and reached out to him. Don't shit yourself. Levi moved his head back into a human and patted Iden on his shoulder. Let me speak, brother. He promptly rested his closed fist on his mouth and cleared his throat. Ira and I serve Lamia. She gave birth to the 7 keepers. You may have heard her other name, Lilith, from school. From now on, you may call yourself a Lylin, a being mocked by her blood. Seven crossed his arms as he watched. We maintain and make sure each deadly scene with their rules function properly, Levi explained. Seven has already mocked you. Remember that pool of blood on the floor of your bedroom. Thousands of images flooded Iden's mind, bringing him back to the moment of his rebirth. That was a contract you unwillingly signed, Levi said. You are one of us, whether you like it or not. Tears trickled down Iden's face. How is that possible? I don't want any part in this. Angels and demons are at constant war. That myth is true, Levi explained. Converting the most humans is not our goal. Seven glued himself to you at the hip because you are the boy who wins the war. Forcing you into our brotherhood was completely his doing. It will most likely come back to haunt us all. I don't get it, Iden replied. I'm just Iden. I haven't done anything significant. I don't want to work for demons. You're the bad guys. Leviathan and Seven cackled in unison. There's a constant imbalance, Levi explained. You fight for us. Balance restored. Yggdrasil happy. You get everything you've ever wanted. Yoda, yoda, yoda. Iden stared at the floor with half-lidded eyes. I think I'm going to pass out. Am I having a heart attack? Who's Yggdrasil? I'll take you to him soon enough, Levi replied. Iden ran his hands through his hair as he took a deep breath. You've used the power my brother gave you well, and I'm excited to see more, Levi said with a smirk. As I said, there are 7 keepers. Belphegor, keeper of sloth. You may call him 1. Beelzebub, keeper of gluttony is 2. Asmodeus, you've already met her, Iden. Images of the bare-naked Mrs. Atkins, sitting on his lap and licking his ear, flashed through his mind. Yes, Iden, her. She is the keeper of lust, known as 3, Levi explained. 7 cackled and popped a piece of candy into his mouth. You've met your principal, Mr. Heather. He is Lucifer, keeper of pride. Call him 4, Levi explained. Mammon is the keeper of greed. You may call him 5. As you've heard many times by now, I am Leviathan. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Newbold, he said as he tipped his imaginary hat. I am the keeper of envy. You may call me 6. 7 watched Iden with a sinister grin. 6 promptly pointed at 7. The infamous Satan, the keeper of wrath. You know him as 7. A new song played out of the house speakers. 6 turned to 7 and folded his arms behind his back. Ira, you know what I want. We can talk logistics when your mind isn't foggy. 7 morphed his head into a ferocious, demonic wolf as he glared at 6. He's mine. 6 chuckled while he circled 7. So much bark. Ira, we're brothers. Learn to share. Iden squinted his eyes. What does he want? 7. 6 interrupted 7 as he turned to Iden with half-lidded eyes. You? Iden felt his stomach turn. There is a political meeting that I must attend, 6 said. I bid you adieu. He nodded and tipped his invisible hat. Just as he stepped out of the room, he looked over his shoulder. 7, he said, and walked away. 7 snarled as he morphed his head back into a human. Iden burped and covered his mouth with his hand. I feel like throwing up. Everything will be okay, kiddo, 7 said, taking a step toward him. That was a lot of information at once. Fuck Nvidia and his fucking mind games. He wants to trade you for the credit of finding you. You are of my blood now, not his. You will be the keeper of wrath. You will be a king of many. I then closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I see your potential, 7 explained. Every chance I get, I will take you to newer heights. Give it time, I then. Enjoy the party. You're safe. I promise you that. Call this place Sanctuary. Go find Charlie and Megan. They are wondering where you've been. I then nodded and tripped on his foot when he turned around. 7 walked through the wall and disappeared. A new song played out of the speakers of the house. I then opened the door and went galumphing down the halls, trying to collect himself. What the fuck did I just walk into? From this point onward, I then saw the world differently. He turned and looked at the Lilin and Nephilim politicians. They looked back. The Nephilim prayed to the heavens. The Lilin stared at Iden with an ominous glare. Their hands were placed on their foreheads, showing devil horns with their fingers. Iden oddly felt like a weight had been lifted. All of his previous problems felt insignificant. It might have been the talk he had with the keepers, but he figured it was the pill he ate prior to the meeting. I then saw himself in the hallway mirrors and noticed his eyes were dilated. The loud party music convinced him to move his body. Another song played throughout the house and into the pool area. Charlie spotted Iden and grabbed his shoulders. Iden, where the fuck were you? I thought you left the party. Iden closed his eyes and gave him a hug. Charlie, 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 Charlie. Shh. I'm sorry, dude. Don't be mad at me. I'll never leave you again. Iden's face was an inch from Charlie's. Why you gonna kiss me, bro? Charlie asked. Iden froze as he stared into his eyes. Charlie turned his head, watching Iden in his peripheral vision. Are you okay, man? Iden wrapped his arms around Charlie and slowed danced with him. Oh, yeah, Megan gave me some candy and I feel great. I had a lovely talk with 6 and 7. I'm so happy I found you. Candy? Charlie asked. What candy? Who or what is 6 and 7? I then. Go find Megan, 7 whispered as he passed by. I then let go of Charlie and scouted the massive property. Charles, I have to go. She's waiting for me. Charlie squinted his eyes. Charles, you're so fucking high. We'll talk later. I then caressed his face with the back of his hand. You're such a good kid, he said, and strutted off in search of Megan. He looked upstairs, in the basement, and went back to the living room. I then couldn't find her anywhere. His energy oozed out of the seams. A very attractive, half-naked girl approached Iden and introduced herself. I then grabbed her face with the palm of his hand and pushed her away. His body felt piping hot, leaving him drenched in sweat. I then, a voice whispered. I then. It sounded like Mrs. Atkins was behind him. So he turned around and saw nothing but intoxicated high school kids. The blaring electronic dance music fueled the crowd and motivated them to indulge in the festivities. I then, Mrs. Atkins whispered, take your clothes off and jump into the pool with me. Take your clothes off. I then, jump into the pool with me. I then. He ran his hands through his hair and faced the open glass door that led to the pool area, then took his clothes off and did a front flip into the pool. The surrounding party-goers took their clothes off, cheered, and jumped in after him. The cool water revitalized him. The thrill of skinny dipping was electric. He floated beneath the surface and closed his eyes. For a moment, he forgot about the world, then opened his eyes and saw nothing but the legs and genitalia of his peers. I then grimaced and stared at the bottom of the pool. A naked woman laid on the pool floor as she glared at him with her protruding eyes. Her hair was raven black and 18 feet in length. It covered the entire floor as it ebbed and flowed. Her hungering glare and missing nose made Aiden's stomach turn. Am I hallucinating off of Megan's candy? Aiden thought. He couldn't help but stare into the mysterious woman's snow-white eyes. The banshee, he named her, grinned from ear to ear with her toothless smile. She quickly cocked her head to the right and writhed on the center of the floor. Her faint voice grew louder the longer she called to him. Aiden, 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 Aiden. He felt skinny arms wrap around his stomach as they pulled his limp body toward the surface. He popped his head out of the water, gasping for air. A new song blared out of the house speakers. Aiden. Megan said with raised brows. Are you okay? Aiden leaned onto her, breathing heavily. Yeah, I'm fine. I think I just needed to cool off. They silently floated naked in each other's arms. Megan clutched and pulled Aiden to the shallow end. You were down there for a while. I'm kind of impressed. It's like you wanted to be a fish and decided to live that life. Aiden rested his head on her shoulder and smirked. Ha ha, we're both naked. Megan giggled as she rested her head on his. Well, Mr. Naked, we need to get you dressed and out of the pool. Aiden raised his head and nodded. Okay. He held her hand on his way out of the pool while he looked for Charlie. Do you know where Charlie is? Is he okay? Megan pointed at Charlie with a smirk on her face. Yeah, I think he'll be fine. Aiden took a glance at where she pointed and found Charlie making out with Griffith. He raised an eyebrow as he scratched the side of his face. What the fuck? Why the fuck is he sucking face with the person who picked on him the most? He thought. On the other hand, it made the most sense. Megan threw Aiden's arm around her neck and brought him to an empty bedroom on the second floor. She dumped Aiden on the bed and left the room. Aiden stared at the ceiling in his birthday suit. Megan eventually returned with their clothing. He sat up and clumsily clothed himself. Once he was finished, he turned to Megan and gently held her hand. I need to tell you something. I barely know you, but I feel really comfortable around you. You make me feel happy. I think I need you. Megan smirked as she held his hand back, then guided him over to the desk chair and sat him down. A new song played out of the house speakers and bled through the cracks of the bedroom door. We've bumped into another adult scene. Thanks, YouTube. Now, on to the next scene. She turned her head and moaned in his ear. Was that fun? She whispered. Oh, fuck yeah, he replied. Megan giggled as she guided him to the bed. It's getting late. You've had a long night, Mr. Naked. You should sleep. I'll see you in the morning. Aiden raised the inside corners of his brows. Do you want to cuddle? Megan smirked as she followed him to the empty bed. She lay down in the middle and invited him over with a beckoning finger. Her perfume gave him a sense of calm and made him feel safe. Aiden curled up next to her and rested his head on her stomach. Wearing a gentle smile, she stroked her fingers through his hair. Aiden, a voice whispered. Aiden. He looked at the ceiling and saw the banshee with her toothless grin. Her head writhed in all directions while black ooze dripped from her open mouth. After his meeting with 6 and 7, he knew that she wasn't a part of his imagination. He closed his eyes and clenched onto Megan. The banshee cackled as she glared at him. A few minutes later, Aiden opened his eyes and found the banshee had vanished. What the fuck is going on with my life? He thought. He snuggled next to Megan and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up to an empty bed. Music softly played out of the house speakers. Aiden sat on the edge of the bed and saw medication on a silver Moroccan serving tray with a glass of ice-cold water next to it. He felt groggy from the long, tumultuous night of drugs and alcohol. He stared at the medication, but decided against taking it. He rubbed his eyes and walked out of the room. Wasn't this place a shithole just a few hours ago? It looks like the party never happened. Iden, dear boy. Six shouted. Come get some brekkie. Iden scouted the room, trying to find a camera. How did he know I was here? He thought. Did I make a lot of noise with the door? Is he psychic or something? He carefully walked down the hall and traveled down the staircase. The furniture in the middle of the living room was covered with beer and cigarette burns 5 hours ago. But this morning, it all looked replaced. Six turned to Iden and welcomed him with a warm smile. Are you interested in eggs and bacon, Mr. Newbold? He asked, keeping close attention to the food in the frying pan. The thought of food made Iden feel sick. No thank you, Mr. Ross. I'm not very hungry. Six chucked the food in the garbage. He grunted. He promptly washed his hands and turned to Iden. No matter, the smell of human food is repulsive. Iden folded his hands on the kitchen island and stared at them with a pinched mouth. Iden, dear boy, Six said, folding his hands behind his back. You're clearly feeling under the weather. You should go home and rest. Spend time with your father, perhaps. I'll come to collect you tomorrow, and we can mingle then. Yes. Iden nodded. Sure, Mr. Ross. So formal, Mr. Newbold. Six chuckled. Please, call me Leviathan. Six for short. Right? Iden replied. I'll see you tomorrow. Six. Six raised his index finger as he watched Iden leave. Bright and early, Mr. Newbold. Iden grabbed the door handle and turned it. Images of the banshee clouded his mind. He promptly turned to Six with knitted brows. Mr. Six, can I ask you something before I go? Six's face lit up. Of course, Mr. Newbold. What would you like? Do you want some breakfast after all? Iden knitted his brows as he stared at the floor. I kept seeing this naked woman with no nose, no teeth, and freakishly long hair. Do you know who that is? Have you seen her too? Six stepped toward him, resting his chin on his hand. He froze in his train of thought. I haven't the slightest clue, Mr. Newbold. Maybe a demon at the party caught wind of how you were blessed by Lamia and had reverence for you. Perhaps it was from the drug you took last night. You should feel honored, Mr. Newbold. I wouldn't think anyone would even dream of hurting you. You have the beast man invariably protecting you. I myself am making sure you do not come into harm's way, which is why I'm seeing you tomorrow morning. This eccentric being, she is no concern to you, Mr. Newbold. You have my word. Iden relaxed his body and took a deep breath. Thank you, Mr. Ross. I feel better. Six gave him a dimpled smile. You are very welcome, he replied. I'll see you tomorrow. If you need a place to stay, you can call this your home away from home. Iden nodded as he walked outside. Iden, a voice whispered. He turned and saw the banshee peeking out of the ajar door. Her hair, eyes, and forehead were the only visible parts of her body. She slowly crept into the house, closing the door behind her. Iden let out a pronounced sigh, then plugged in his earphones and listened to music on his phone. Seven appeared with his bag of candy and accompanied him on his walk home. Iden opened the front door of his house. He saw Edward sitting in his favorite chair, watching television, feeling exhausted from the night prior. Iden dashed for his room in a desperate attempt to relax. Iden, you're home, Edward shouted. How was your night, son? Seven ate his candy with half-lidded eyes. This fucking guy again. Iden took 2 steps up the staircase before he stopped and turned to his father. It was fun, Dad. I met a lot of new people. I think I have a girlfriend now. Edward cheered as he pointed at Iden with the remote controller in his hand. That's my boy, he said, beckoning him. Sit on the couch for a minute. Iden ambled to the living room and sat on the couch. Seven rolled his eyes and popped a piece of candy into his mouth. I know how kids are, Edward said as he placed the remote controller on his lap. Were you well behaved? Were there drugs and alcohol at that party? Aiden smirked. There was. But I just let the other kids do it. That stuff isn't for me. 7 chortled, almost choking on his candy. Smooth, he said, shaking the bottom of his paper bag. Edward let out a sigh of relief and made his way to the kitchen sink. I'm proud of you, son. It fills me with joy knowing that you knew better than to reduce yourself to that level of irresponsibility. Sigh. Mr. Ross said that if I ever needed a place to crash, I could go there. Aiden explained. His house was pretty amazing. It was so spacious and really nice on the inside. I wish we had a home like that. What if he asked us to live there? Edward glanced at the floor with a tight-lipped smile and turned to Aiden. Son, the need to have what other people own, what others have for yourself, is self-destructive. You can't focus on what others have. There are tons of people out there who resort to voyeurism and terrible things. Just focus on what you have on the inside. Aiden. Charity, compassion, friendship, and sympathy without prejudice. Just remember that. 7 waved his hand and watched with an ominous grin. Aiden rolled his eyes and interrupted him. Stop, he screamed. Just stop. I don't give a shit. Why do you insist on telling me this shit? He immediately spotted Edward's lopsided grimace. Son, I'm trying my best to, he replied. A mysterious pair of a man and woman spoke to Aiden in unison. Do not listen to him, they whispered. He speaks of lies. I don't care. Aiden shouted. I didn't ask for advice. So do us both a favor and fuck off. Edward stared at him with the inside corners of his eyebrows raised. I'm going to bed, Aiden said, and stormed to his room. Once inside, he slammed the door. Good night, son, Edward murmured. 7 leaned against a wall, slowly clapping with a grin on his face. Aiden collapsed onto his bed and passed out. Aiden, a voice whispered. He slowly opened his eyes and saw Megan looming over him with a blank face. His eyes broadened. Holy shit, you're in my room. I'm sorry, my room looks like shit. With a gentle smile, Megan rested her index finger on his lips. It's fine. The only thing I care about is seeing you. She snuggled up next to him and closed her eyes. Aiden, can I tell you something? He stared at the ceiling and nodded. Of course. I fucking hate my mom, Megan said. My dad went crazy, so we sent him to a psychiatric ward. My mom is never home, and when she is, I don't want to be around. Can I stay here with you? Without hesitation, Aiden looked her in the eye and smiled. You can stay with me for as long as you want. How did you get in here, anyway? Through the window, she explained. I saw your dad watching TV and didn't want to get caught. So I climbed up the side of your house, hanging upside down from the ceiling. 7 cackled as he watched. That human could be worth something to us. Aiden, think about it. Aiden glanced at 7 with knitted brows. We're not going to use her. Megan turned to where he was looking. Who are you talking to, Aiden? Let her see me, 7 said with an ominous grin. I want this one to see me. No, Aiden shouted. Megan got off the bed and stepped away from him. Aiden, you're scaring me. Maybe I should leave. I'm sorry I barged into your room uninvited. I'll just leave. I'm sorry, she murmured as she hastily gathered her things. On her way out, a pair of glowing blood-red eyes locked onto hers. She stopped dead in her tracks, unable to take another step. Aiden rolled his eyes at 7. Now you've done it. 7 guffawed while his glowing ruby red eyes dotted from one side of the room to the next. Aiden, Megan cried out. 7's eyes suddenly vanished. Moments later, the closet door swung open. Megan jumped and turned in its direction. 7 slowly emerged from the shadows, bearing his sharp fangs. The tears in Megan's eyes trickled down her pale face. 7, Aiden shouted. Cut the shit. 7 cackled as he morphed back into a human. He ambled out of the somber closet with the appearance of a teenager from Forest High. "Hello, Megan Reed, I'm 7. Megan narrowed her brows as she raised her chin. "How do you know my name?" 7 grinned as he folded his hands behind his back. "I know everything. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. You're the perfect human for my den. Not too bright though. Who the fuck are you?" Megan asked. "How do you know me?" Den. 7 glared at her during his demonic transformation. Megan clenched her fists as she locked eyes with the hulking beast who towered over her. Laughing hysterically, 7 broke character. "She's amazing, Den." Megan stood her ground and wiped away the single tear that trickled down her face. Den stared at the overgrown prankster with pinched lips. 7 awkwardly grabbed the bag of candy that sat on Iden's desk and ate a piece. With squinted eyes, Megan pointed at the brown paper bag. "What is that?" "What? It's candy," 7 shouted. "I like candy. Doesn't human food upset you?" Den asked. "An interesting question," 7 replied. "Think of the yeast extracted in Australia. It's an acquired taste. You either hate it or love it. I, for one, love it." Megan glared at 7 with knitted brows. "What the fuck are you?" 7 returned to his human form and folded his hands behind his back. "I am the former keeper of Wrath. I am Iden's guardian." Megan dotted a glance between the pair. "What the fuck does that even mean? Why should I care?" 7 leaned toward Iden and nudged his arm before popping another piece of candy into his mouth. "She's perfect," he whispered as he grinned with glee. Iden turned to 7 with squinted eyes. "What, boy?" 7 asked. "I wanted to test the bitch." Iden grabbed his backpack full of books and school supplies and threw them at 7. "Fine." Iden screamed. "You got what you wanted. Get the fuck out of here." 7 ducked underneath the backpack and stared at him. Iden stared back with a fiery glare. 7 promptly bowed his head and ambled through the wall. "As you wish, Your Majesty." Iden let out a pronounced sigh and turned to Megan. "I'm sorry for that, Megan." Megan rested her forehead on his chest. "I need a fucking bowl. You can explain things tomorrow morning. I need a serious cuddle." Iden sat on his bed and waited for her. Megan walked over to her jacket to grab her phone and her bowl. Iden leaned against the headboard of his bed while she sat across from him with her legs crossed. They listened to music and shared a bowl before bed. The next morning, Iden and Megan woke up and sat on opposite sides of the bed. Iden wiped the room from his eyes and turned to her. She pulled her shorts up and turned to him. "Thank you for letting me stay the night." Iden pinched his lips. "Anytime." Megan grabbed her bag. "I need to go home. We'll talk about what happened later, okay?" Iden ambled to his desk and sat in his chair. "Of course, I'll see you then. I think my dad left. Just use the front door." Megan smirked as she made her way downstairs. Iden looked to his left and found 7 hanging from the ceiling, stuffing his face with his beloved candy. He shot out of his chair and pointed at the keeper's face. "We need to talk." 7 turned his body upright and landed on the bedroom floor. "Yes." Iden stared into 7's turquoise eyes as he gritted his teeth. "Why the fuck did you do that? You seriously fucked me. Do you realize what you've done? Leave me the fuck alone." 7 raised his right brow as he looked down at him. "I gave you your strength, boy. I helped bring light to your dull, boring, trivial existence. I helped you save that bundle of sticks you call a friend. Megan wouldn't give a donkey fuck about you. Without me, I saw the potential in you. Me, the least you could fucking do is show some appreciation. You little shit." The veins in his face pulsated with the rigid cords in his neck. Iden stared at the ground while he scratched the back of his neck. 7 ate a piece of candy from his brown paper bag. "Are we done here, Your Majesty?" Iden nodded and walked to his desk. "Yeah, we're done here. 7 stared at him with a blank face. Get changed, you fucking donkey. We have a busy day ahead of us. On her way out of the house, Edward spotted Megan. He raised his right hand and waved at her. Hey. Megan froze and immediately turned to him. Edward smirked as he raised his chin. You must be. Megan stepped forward and interrupted him. Megan, my name's Megan, Mr. Newbold. Edward wore a dimpled smile. A beautiful young lady, and she has etiquette. It's nice to meet you, Megan. Megan smirked as she clutched her bag. It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Newbold. Please, call me Edward, he said. Can you do me a solid, Megan? Megan swung her bag onto her back and pinched her lips. Sure. Edward leaned into his careless dude chair and rested the remote controller on his stomach. Please, take care of my boy. Look out for him. I try my best, but I think he's at that stage where I'm seen as the villain. You're his friend. He'll listen to you. Megan gave him a gentle smile. Sure thing, Edward. You have my word. Edward smirked. Thank you. You're a good kid. Megan relaxed her shoulders. No problem, Edward. I don't want to hold you up any further, he said with a blithesome demeanor. Once again, it was nice to meet you, Megan. You are welcome to come back whenever you want. Just use the front door next time. You got it, she replied, closing the door behind her on the way out. Later that day, Edward left the house and went to work. Aiden and 7 walked through the front door and saw 6, who stood next to his car. 7 looked at his broad smile and rolled his eyes. 6 promptly waved at the sulking pair. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Aiden waved back. 7 ambled toward the car with his face buried into his bag of candy. Hello, brother. 6 made his way to the driver's seat. Let's meet the rest of the family and introduce little Aiden to the family business, shall we? Aiden dotted a glance between the 2 men as he sat in the back. 6 looked through the rearview mirror. Make yourselves comfy. We have ourselves a bit of a drive. He cleared his throat and fired the ignition. Music played out of the radio. 6 pulled out of the driveway, glancing at 7 as he watched the road. Let's start with Mammon. 7 ate a piece of candy as he stared out of the passenger window. Sure, I don't care. 6's face lit up. Good. He and I work very well together. I need to talk business with him anyway. They eventually drove out of suburbia and traversed the big city. 6 pulled into a Mad Clon's parking lot and parked the car. Last stop. Everybody out. 7 rolled his eyes on his way out of the car. 6 hopped out, grinning as he strutted toward the entrance of the restaurant. Mad Clons. Why are we here, 6? Aiden asked. I thought you didn't like food. Very true, dear boy, 6 replied. We're here for Mammon. The world knows him as Isaac Clons, the owner of the franchise. Holy shit, Aiden shouted. Half of the face-stuffing patrons inside turned and stared at him before returning to their meals. Shh, 6 whispered. Quiet, boy. We don't want to make a scene, do we? Aiden scouted the restaurant and nodded. Right, sorry. 5 walked out of the kitchen and approached them. He had thick black hair and wore a white suit with a black tie. He turned to 6 and pointed at Aiden. Is this the kid? 6 grinned like the Cheshire Cat. Yes, brother, this is the boy. 5 stared at Aiden with an ominous gaze. A cold sweat ran down the side of Aiden's face. Minutes of being locked into 5's amber-colored eyes were but seconds to him. All right then, 5 said, reaching into his suit pocket. If you and your friends want free shit, go to one of my locations at your convenience and use this membership card. Aiden promptly grabbed the emerald green card and examined it. Thank you, Mr. Clons. 5 smirked. Huh? Does he call you Mr. Ross? 6 turned to him and nodded. Huh? Brilliant. 5 cheered. Who knows how far he'll really go, eh? Will he exceed expectations? Who knows? 7. How much for him? Aiden felt a creeping chill. Fuck off. Ava right here, 7 replied. He's priceless, not for sale. I then let out a sigh of relief. 5 raised his chin. Oh pish posh, Ira. I have all of the money the boy could ever want. I'm very close to owning the world. All you have is that temper of yours. 7 breathed heavily as he glared at 5 with his blood-red eyes. My point exactly, 5 said, folding his hands behind his back. Anything that is mine, Ira, name it and it's yours. I want the kid. So first, Nvidia tells me he wants him, and now you, 7 said, knitting his brows. I'm not surprised, but fuck off, both of you. 5 and 6 looked at each other and smiled. What's with wearing white? I then asked. Why is it so popular? 5 straightened his suit. This is what style looks like, kid. I think that's what a tool looks like. I then replied. 7 held his stomach as he guffawed. 5 cleared his throat and crossed his arms. My number is on the back of that card, kid. If you want to start owning the world, use that number. 7 pissed on you, marking you as his, but you ultimately have the real choice. Remember that. Let's rid you of your financial troubles. Why don't we make you an author? We'll write a book for you and magically blow it up. A 5-book series, maybe a movie, perhaps a shitty phone app, a coloring book, some bullshit clothing line. I'll get working on it and send you checks. You and your father never have to worry about money again. He stared at the ground and looked back at the keepers who loomed over him. I appreciate this a lot. But what will you need from me if I just take all of this? 5 turned to his brothers and smirked at Aiden. You'll find out, I'm sure. Aiden dotted a glance between them. 5 stared at him with a blank face. Doubt me now, kid. If I've learned anything, dealing with humans, greed always finds a way. A woman wearing a blazer with pushed up, jet black hair walked out of the kitchen and ambled toward the group. Her ensemble was snow white. Beelzebub, 7 whispered. I then overheard 7 and turned to her. He scratched his head as he stared at her for an extended amount of time. She's not fat or a man. 2 eventually made her way to the group. 7 welcomed her with a humble bow. Hello, sister. 2 bowed to him in return. Greetings, brother. It feels like ages since I've seen you. She looked at each of them individually. Any word on the human? It's been 18 years, Ira. 7 turned to Aiden and pointed at him. Ask him yourself. 2 promptly turned her head and gazed at Aiden with a shining grin. I can see why Luxuria is so infatuated with him. Aiden blushed as he dotted a glance between them. 2 straightened her posture and raised her chin. What is your name? I'm Aiden, Miss Beelzebub, he replied. 2's face lit up. Huh? Miss Beelzebub. Does he do that with the rest of you? Each keeper replied with a nod. Well, dear Aiden, 5, 6, and I have similar motives with how we like to run things, 2 explained. In the human world, 5 inspires man with what we own, just to take it from them in one fell swoop. I take those people and make them desire our products way more than they should in their life. Our food slowly but surely kills them. That is a fact. 6 makes them hate our very existence. He's very good at it, very good at marketing, I must say. Aiden knitted his brows as he stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. I should have known Mad Clones was owned by demons. Their burgers are so small for what you pay for. The slop you call Mad Sauce almost immediately gives me the shits. It's truly sinister. The group of demons stared at Aiden. A moment later, they burst into laughter. 6 turned to his siblings as he pointed at Aiden with open hands. Isn't he a gem? The keepers chuckled as they grinned at one another. He will do just fine, 5 said. Just fine. Excellent work claiming him, 7. He'll be a hit with the women if he isn't already, I'm sure, 2 said. 7 turned to his siblings and stepped forward. He will reign over our inferior siblings and lead our myriad armies to victory. I've seen it time and time again. but he will only get there if you stop trying to take him from me. I know what I'm doing. Let the boy marinate, please. Fine, brother, 5 said, grinning at Iden. This has definitely been an experience. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Ira. He stepped toward Iden and folded his hands behind his back. As I said before, Iden, if you're away from home and you want free food, go to any Mad Clon's location and give them your card. If they give you a hard time, call me with that number, and it will never happen again. Iden smiled as he nodded. Thank you, 5. I also own a few casinos, 5 said with his portentous demeanor. There's one location here in the province. Bring your friends. 6 handed him an eggshell white business card. If you get yourself into some unfortunate events, here's my card. I'm a lawyer. Thank you, La. 6. Iden replied. I know where to find you. 2 turned to Iden and leaned toward him. I guess this is where I shower you with things I own. HM. Iden glanced at the other keepers, then turned to her. I am the one who encouraged fat people with failing hearts to buy one last cheeseburger, to explained. The one who carries a salad in one hand with a bowl of sugar in the other, getting someone so deep into a bottle they lose control of the wheel and kill an innocent bystander, giving cancer to that person who says, just one more cigarette, and then I'm done. Here's my all-access card. I am the chairman of the Liquor Control Board of the country. I also own Torrance Browned Pork, Tommy Fried, Mad Clons, Patty Prince, etc., etc. I own all of it. This black card that I give you is access to all of it, and as much of it as you want. Iden faced the group and cleared his throat. Thank you for giving me all of this. I don't know what to say. He locked eyes with each keeper who stood in front of him. I don't even know what you want from me, he said. This entire time, all of you have been speaking in code, and I have no fucking idea what you want me to do. Don't worry, boy, 6 replied. 7, and I will bring you to Yggdrasil once this is over. You will understand. 5 turned to 6 with a tight-lipped smile. It sounds like the boy is eager. Eula and I won't keep you waiting any longer. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Mr. Newbold. You too, Mr. Mammon, Iden replied. Charmed, 2 said, and walked to the back of the restaurant with 5 by her side. All right, it's time to see Yggdrasil, 6 said, on his way to the front entrance. We should go as soon as possible. The 2 keepers and Iden walked to the car and hopped inside. 6 fired up the engine and buckled himself in. It's time for the Lion and Phoenix. Music played out of the stereo. He pulled out of the parking lot, and the group traversed the city once again. So, Leviathan, Iden said, if Megan had been dating Griffith for so long, why was she so surprised after seeing 7's true form? 7 smirked as he looked at 6. Griffith was just a placeholder to make sure no one would steal her from you, 6 explained. He waited until you were ready to meet her. You both crossed each other's paths at the perfect moment and did everything you were supposed to in order to gain each other's interests. 7 looked through the rearview mirror and ate a piece of candy. Are you still following, kiddo? So my feelings for Megan were predetermined. I then asked. More like foreseen, 6 explained. She makes you happy, doesn't she? You feel like you were made for each other, right? Griffith had merely just been holding on to her for you. He kept your seat warm, as it were. I then looked out of the window and questioned his life. What is the Lion and Phoenix? The Lion and Phoenix is a sanctuary for Lil-In and Nephilim alike, 7 replied. 6 grinned as he kept his eyes on the road. It's where mommy and daddy go to talk things out, dear boy. Even gods need diplomacy. I then covered his face with his hands. This is overwhelming. You're evil. I don't want to fucking do this. 7 cackled as he grabbed his bag of candy. 6 locked the car doors and looked at Iden through the rearview mirror. Listen to me, dear boy. Our views and values of the world may be different from those of angels, but we both desire equilibrium. We know that it is recommended to have the upper hand or more influence over the other. If there is too much of one side, the other can't exist, and well, that would bring an end to everything. 7 popped a piece of candy into his mouth and looked over his shoulder. And that's no fun at all. If we handle things this way, there is serenity, and we profit off of them as well, 6 explained. I know this is a lot of information, dear boy, but 7 was lucky enough to find you after discovering how valuable you really are. Iden stared out of his window. You are very important to us, 6 said as he watched the road. We're not the bad guys, Iden. In this play, God accepts both Cain and Abel's sacrifices. Cain kills Abel and gets rewarded for it. Do you know why? Iden stared at the passing cars as he pondered. 6 looked through the rearview mirror. If we never stepped in, impregnated Eve, and delivered Cain into the world, what would life be, Iden? 7 chortled, almost choking on his candy. Boring as shit. Iden held himself as he quivered. A tidal wave of anxiety washed over him. 6 and 7 guffawed while they stared at the terrified boy. Iden darted a glance between the keepers. I'm scared. Dear boy, there is no need to feel this way, 6 replied. Accept Lamia's gift and embrace her love. You are truly loved, and you don't realize it. You have nothing to fear, Iden. I promise you this. Accept the power that will expel all evil from this world. Iden knitted his brows and stared at his feet. 7 may not show it, but he loves you dearly, like a son, 6 explained. This is the most affection I've seen him show any of us, let alone a human. He believes in you so much that he refused every single one of his siblings' offers. Believe me, I want you to myself more than anything. I've offered the artifact I have protected since the beginning of time, and still, he's declined. 7 rested his bag of candy on his lap and stared out of the window. We're almost there. I'd enjoy the rest of the ride in silence. Iden folded his hands on his lap and pondered. 15 minutes passed before 6 pulled into a driveway that led into an underground parking lot. He parked the car, and the group hopped out. The 3 of them walked toward the only door in the garage. Iden spotted the 2 men who guarded it. It was very clear they were unworldly beings. A golden halo floated above the angelic side of their heads, and a thick black horn out of the leathery, scarlet-skinned, demonic side. Their celeste blue iris blanketed their pinpoint pupils. Their ensemble was white 3-piece business suits with black ties. Iden looked at 6. Who are they? Agents of Yggdrasil, 6 explained. They are named Cerberus. High-ranking Nephilim and Lilin get an audience with Yggdrasil and are offered to serve him. It's a painful process. Very prestigious. They act as police and protect the Lion and Phoenix. Cerberus are deployed all over the world in case of strife. 7 looked over his shoulder. None of us dare challenge them, Iden. They are tenacious bitters. The only reason 6 and I would walk away the victor is that we are the keepers. An average Nephilim or Lilin would be obliterated. To fight them at all would cause strife. Both Yggdrasil and the 7 cardinal virtues would join forces to eliminate us. It wouldn't be wise to do this. Avoid conflict with them at all costs, Iden. Iden stared at the guards with tunnel vision. Don't look into their eyes, boy, 6 explained. You're not fully one of us yet. Their divinity will drive you mad. The keepers and Iden approached the Cerberus agents, showing them a branded tree on the back of their hands. Half of it was burned and destroyed, while the other side, beautiful and flourishing. An agent cocked his head and raised an eyebrow at 6. Your business here. The Cerberus voice echoed, as if there were 2 souls trapped inside of one body. 6 faced the agent, and cleared his throat. "We're here to see Yggdrasil. We have recourse to entreaty." The second Cerberus agent glared at Iden, sniffing as he pointed to him. "What is that smelly thing doing here, Leviathan?" Iden stared at the ground and rested his left hand on his right elbow. Six looked at the agent with a blank face. "He is the reason why we're here. Yggdrasil will be expecting him." The keepers and Iden patiently waited for a response. The agent glared at Iden with repugnance. "We'll find out how he'll handle himself soon enough." The agent, parallel to the first, stared at Iden while he opened the door. The bowels of the lion and phoenix became visible. Six nodded and tipped his invisible hat. Seven morphed his head into a terrifying wolf and backed at an agent on his way inside, making them flinch. Iden promptly followed the keepers into the club. An agent pointed at Seven. "Control your fucking dog, Leviathan." Seven looked over his shoulder and gave them the finger. Six looked at his brother and chuckled. The door closed, and purple LED lights illuminated the hallway. Music blared out of the club speakers. As they traversed the main hallway, Iden heard horrific screams from tortured souls. The keepers and Iden eventually arrived at the main hall. Cliques and officials of both worlds were at their own sections of the room. Topless Lylin women served their faction, while clothed Nephilim women served theirs. Human slaves gave their bodies willingly. A mysterious group wore black hooded capes, lined with thick wolf's fur. They stared at Iden with a cold glare. Nephilim agents wore black suits with a crest of their cardinal virtue above their breast pocket. Lylin of all deadly sins had their own tables and sections. Iden spotted a table of horrifying demons named Xeroxic near the elevator. They had no eyes or noses. Their large, razor-sharp fangs were their trademark. The keepers and Iden walked past the table. A demon noticed Iden and spoke to him in its demonic tongue. As it looked at its brothers, Yeruthaktawi, Sopnap Stipa Rita Timnias Kakoi, ha ha ha. Seven turned to the demon, snarling at it. The demon jumped in its seat. Doubt, Dith, Soto Inist Marithaun Melt, Relpvaches. Iden frantically looked at the keepers and the table of demons. What the fuck is he saying? He thought. The demon's face lit up as it desperately looked around the table. Can't have Senedtum, Dinited in the Demnesterind. Six signaled one of the professionals over, much like the Nephilim agent. It wore a snow-white suit with a house crest above its breast pocket. Its hollowed eyes looked like a solar eclipse. Six pointed at the demon with his index and middle finger like a gun and fired it. The demon at the table quivered in fear, turning to its brothers in a blind panic. The professional quickly pulled its hand cannon from the holster and aimed betwixt the demon's eyes. Bofji Tove. The demon cried out, Eli Muley. The professional promptly fired the massive hand cannon, instantly exploding the demon's head. Jet black viscous ooze sprayed over the table and adjacent demons. The Nephilim and Lylin in the main hall stared at Iden and the keepers. Six straightened his suit. First impressions day. Iden's eyes bulged out of his face. Seven nudged his elbow. Keep walking, Iden. We're almost there. They stood in front of the elevator, and Six pressed the only button on the panel. Seven cackled as he reached for his bag of candy. What a show, Nvidia. I haven't been here in ages, Six replied. Nothing says, I'm here, like killing your own in the presence of Nephilim. The elevator arrived, and the door opened. A hulking holy knight ambled out of it. He wore a massive set of platinum armor, bearing 8 gorgeous angelic wings with a brilliant hue of light. His bright golden eyes nearly blinded Iden, forcing him to shield his eyes with his forearm. Seven stared at the massive knight while he chewed on his favorite candy. Azrael, he muttered. Azrael spotted the keepers and approached them. He promptly pointed at Iden while locking eyes with Seven. You cheated me, Satan. You will soon meet retribution. His divine voice echoed as if he spoke inside of a massive wind tunnel. 7 stood still with a blank face. Asriel walked past them and gathered his men to the entrance of the club. Iden and the keepers promptly entered the elevator. 6 pressed the only button on the elevator panel. The door closed, and they descended into a deep part of the lithosphere. Iden squinted his eyes at the panel. Why is there only one button? Great things happen when dealing with Yggdrasil, 6 explained. He enjoys doing business, uninterrupted. Iden scratched his head. Who was that angel who walked out of the elevator? His name is Asriel, 7 explained. Like the 7 deadly sins, there are also 7 cardinal virtues. We have been in many wars since the beginning of time. We simply complete each other. I am the keeper of wrath. 6 raised his index finger, interrupting him. Former keeper of wrath. 7 glanced at 6 and looked back at the elevator indicator. Former keeper of wrath, and he is the guardian of patience, a cardinal virtue. He is the yang to my yin. It looked like he scared you, Iden said. We are at the brink of another war, 7 replied. I'm surprised he didn't attack me. Regardless of being inside Yggdrasil's house, he has incredible self-restraint. I've tested him countless times, and he continues to leap over every obstacle that is thrown his way. 6 turned his head and jeered him. You could have taken him, P-word. 7 winked at 6. His fear smelled like shit. The elevator door opened, and the group ambled out. A squad of Cerberus agents patrolled the floor, protecting Yggdrasil while he worked in his study. The scent of jasmine lingered in each room. Iden and the keepers walked past the agents by the elevator door and went into Yggdrasil's study, where they found him looming over his fireplace. Classical music played out of Yggdrasil's vinyl turntable. Asriel was just here, Yggdrasil said. You need to be more cautious of him, Ira. The boy created a massive ripple in our pond. Me. Iden asked. Yggdrasil turned and walked toward them. He wore a black and white suit vest. The darkness of the room swallowed his face, baring his reflective eyes. The sight of him made Iden's skin crawl. Yes, both sides agreed there would be zero interference with humans, just influence. Yggdrasil explained. That is how things worked until Asriel spotted your soul. Iden, you were almost claimed by a guardian. Ira tricked Asriel and claimed you for himself. Iden glanced at 7 and looked at Yggdrasil. What does that mean for me? Yggdrasil grabbed his glass of Ikairos malt and took a sip. That means you are the one who will bring us equilibrium ad infinitum. So what? Iden pondered. Are you telling me that I can dodge bullets? 7 shook the bottom of his brown paper bag and popped a piece of candy into his mouth. Iden, don't be R-worded. 6 cleared his throat as he clenched his fists. Whether you are with the keepers or guardians, it matters not, Yggdrasil explained, locking eyes with Iden. We would achieve this goal one way or the other. He took a step closer to Iden as he raised his chin. When you choose to stop your frivolity and change the world forever, we can begin this journey of yours together. At the end of this, you can have a life of your own and wallow in opulence, or you can continue this life of disarray, being a nobody. He held his hand out, beckoning Iden. Come with me, child, he said. 6 and 7 stood near the entrance of the study. Iden walked with Yggdrasil to his fireplace and patiently waited. Give me your hand, Yggdrasil said. Iden promptly gave him his right hand. Firmly grasping it, Yggdrasil turned the backside of his wrist downward and held it over the flame of his fireplace. The blazing hot flame swallowed Iden's hand. He screamed for mercy. Ugh. 6 and 7 watched with blank faces. Iden desperately tried to save his hand from the scorching flame, but Yggdrasil easily overpowered him. Moments later, Yggdrasil lifted his hand from the fireplace and let go. Feeling agonizing pain, Iden clutched his wrist. He turned his hand and saw the same insignia 6 and 7 had been branded with. Yggdrasil leaned on the edge of his desk and took another sip of whiskey. That is an unlimited season pass to the Lion and Phoenix. Show my agents that symbol and they will grant you entry. I then ground his teeth as he stumbled back to 6 and 7. 7 stepped forward and bowed to Yggdrasil. Thank you, Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil nodded and continued his paperwork. 6 pressed the button on the panel, and they waited for the elevator to arrive. If Yggdrasil keeps the balance, why isn't he the poster boy for this fucking war? I then muttered. Think of him as if he were the police. I then, 6 explained. That's all he can do, keep the peace. Yggdrasil can be awake 24 hours a day trying to do what you can, but he will fail without question. You, dear boy, can and will finish this war, at least for many lifetimes. The elevator doors opened after the bell rang. The 3 of them stepped inside and traveled back to the first floor. 6 gleefully looked at Iden with his hands folded behind his back. Wasn't today so fun? Iden firmly gripped his wrist in an attempt to steady his violently shaky hand. I just want to go home. I've seen enough crazy shit for one day. 7 glanced at Iden and turned to 6 with an ominous grin. Why don't you just kill me and bring equal whatever the fuck? Now, I then asked. We have to groom you into the perfect specimen, 6 explained. If we sacrifice you now, it would ruin the chance we have, and we would have to wait thousands of years, possibly more. The elevator bell rang, then opened its doors. Strobe lights flashed with beams of light, dotting from one side of the room to the next. Club music blared through the stereo system. All species of women filled the center of the room and carelessly danced in ecstasy. The Nephilim and cardinal virtues had entirely left the club. The Lylin lingered as if they were celebrating. Some sat at tables while others were lost in the music, pottying with one another. The professionals who remained wore silicone masks that periodically changed their facial expressions. They carefully watched as Iden and the keepers ventured to the front entrance. Once they approached it, the door opened. A Cerberus agent watched them leaving. How was your dog, Leviathan? Did he shit on the floor again? The agent next to him chuckled. Iden and the keepers ambled past them and made their way to the car. Before 7 got into the car, he looked over his shoulder. I took a shit on your lunch. The agent glared at 7 as he gave him the finger. 7 sat in the passenger seat, and they promptly left the parking lot. 7 looked at Iden through the rearview mirror. Time to go home, yeah. Iden's face lit up. Finally, yes, please, take me home. 7 chuckled as he reached for his bag of candy. Long day, huh? Are you fucking kidding me? Iden replied, knitting his brows. 7 looked at 6 with broadened eyes. Oh, our little trip today gave him a backbone. 6 looked at Iden through the rearview mirror. I know that it must have been a long day, dear boy. We're going back to the house. Final stop, I promise. Iden slammed his fist against the car seat. Fuck off. I'm exhausted. Drive me home, now. 6 glared at Iden before he caught himself and displayed a gentle demeanor. Subdue your anger, boy. You'll like this surprise. Iden threw his phone at the passenger door parallel to him and stared at the passing street lights. The dark, starry sky swallowed the city. An hour later, 6 pulled into the driveway of the mansion. He drove to the back of the house and parked the car. 5 other cars were parked there as well. Who owns these? Iden thought. 6 turned the engine off and got out of the car. Time to go inside, dear boy. 7 got out of the car and opened Iden's door for him. Iden used one arm, taking his time getting out. The group ambled up the driveway and made their way toward the back end of the house. The glass house had been covered with crimson-red drapes. Iden and the keepers traversed the pool area and approached the back door. 6 opened it, and they walked inside. In the middle of the living room, there was a massive conversation area with a small staircase on each side of it. Aiden spotted 5 people sitting in it. He squinted his eyes as he and the keepers approached them. Aiden's eyes broadened once he saw the captivating Mrs. Atkins, who was deep in conversation. She turned to Aiden and was suddenly elated. "Aiden," she cheered, "I've missed you." The adjacent group got out of their seats, revealing their faces. It was the remaining keepers. An unknown keeper approached Aiden with a warm smile. "I see you're still in pain. How unfortunate. Welcome to our club, young one." Aiden held his wrist as he stared at the mysterious keeper. His amber-colored eyes gave Aiden goosebumps. His jet black hair was combed back, and like his siblings, he also wore a white suit vest. Demonic tattoos covered most of his body, with few on his face. Six turned to Aiden as he folded his hands behind his back. "This is the final deadly scene, Aiden." Belphegor, the keeper of Sloth. Belphegor lit a cigarette and nodded. "You can call me One." Aiden promptly nodded back. One chuckled as he turned to Seven. "He certainly is interesting, Ira. For once, I feel like I can get invested." Seven glanced at Aiden before turning to his brother. "He's had a long day, Tristatir. He's ready to go home." One chuckled on his way to the kitchen for a drink. "Clearly he's exhausted. But the mind-numbing Yggdrasil was the reason why you ran errands. His method of work is humdrum. Fuck me, talking to him is like pulling teeth." 3 lifted her breasts and caressed Aiden's cheek, then guided him to the conversation area and sat him down before sitting on his lap. She ran her fingers through his hair and brushed her breasts against his face. "You must feel so tired, so thirsty, so hungry. Poor baby," she whispered as she pecked his right cheek. Seven turned to them and saw what she was doing. "Asmodeus, get the fuck off of him. Show some restraint," she hissed as she stumbled over herself until she climbed out of the conversation area. One ambled toward Aiden while carrying a golden goblet and his karambit knife. "Okay, listen, we're all here to welcome you to the family. That's it," he explained with a wink. "After this little get-together, you can go back to your father. You know, the one who preaches every little thing. It gets old, doesn't it? I know you are tired of his shit. As soon as I hand you this goblet, drink from it immediately." Aiden watched as One clutched his knife and held the goblet outward before stabbing himself in the chest. His jet-black blood oozed out of the open cavity and poured into the goblet. He quickly handed the goblet to Aiden as he dropped to one knee. "Drink it," Seven shouted. Aiden impetuously snatched the goblet out of One's hand and drank every drop. The viscous black blood was harder to get down than he first thought. It writhed and grabbed onto his throat and innards on its way down. Aiden promptly let go of the goblet, dropping it onto the floor. At that moment, something about himself had seriously changed. Seconds felt like hours. He suddenly went limp and collapsed onto the wooden floor. The keepers patiently watched him struggle. The clanging of the goblet hitting the floor became deafening. One turned the stereo system on, with music blasting out of the house speakers. Aiden felt his erector pili muscles contract. In an instant, his body meant nothing but the shell he once inhabited. He was immediately lifted to space, seeing through multiple dimensions of lights and colors. Intricate geometric patterns formed in and out of each other like a complete puzzle. They expanded and contracted at intense speeds. At that moment, he realized how small he was and truly experienced ego death. He tossed and turned like laundry in a washing machine until he ended up in a hallway of a palace. Canals filled with water poured out of each room and swallowed Aiden whole. A great force dragged him into a dark void that exploded into a monsoon of pink, cyan, orange, and red clouds. They formed into yellow and blue orbs that flew past him at the speed of light. Tiny dots pushed away from each other and pulled back into massive triangles. They quickly changed into circles that melted over Aiden's body. All of the colors dripped to his feet and expanded into an infinite number of eyes that grew slightly larger with each layer. The pupils pulsated until they dissolved into nothingness. The eyes expanded into a moon of bright yellow and purple geometric patterns, then rotated left while a wall of tiny green tornadoes rotated to the right. Aiden saw a cloud of dark shades and colors. Once he thought of Seven, Griffith, and the demons he had met. He connected those people to the feeling of hatred and anger. And once he realized he was the one who allowed himself those emotions, the dark cloud blossomed into a beautiful flower. The more he marveled at the flower, the more it flourished. He suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of love and understanding. All of his physical and mental desires washed away from existence. Aiden looked down at earth and plummeted toward his body. His soul slammed into it, and he promptly jumped onto his feet to look at himself in a mirror. His eyes developed a pupillar duplex. The sclera of his eyes had turned yellow. His iris, a blood red. He spotted a fly from across the room and watched it closely with ease. The anatomy of the fly was clear as crystal. His hand healed instantaneously, ridding it of any pain that lingered. A potent wave of strength consumed his body. Do I get to wear a suit? Can I shoot webs at people? Aiden asked. Seven squinted his eyes as he ate a piece of candy. What the foo? Aiden looked at the wall next to him. The wall had tons of phrases in different languages. Aiden turned to the keepers and squinted his eyes. Il n'y a pas de fumée sans feu. Where there's smoke, there's fire. How do I know French? Six stepped forward. It's one of the many packs. Dear boy, if you're going to rule the world, you must understand it. Aiden heard the voice of a man and woman. He is coming, they whispered. You must stop him. Don't let him get here. It will ruin you. Tell him you're staying. Tell him to leave. Aiden squinted his eyes as he turned to Six. What the fuck was that? I can hear voices too. Six froze as he stared at him. We don't hear voices. That's not a keeper trait. What did they say? Aiden stared at the floor and pondered. Nothing. It's not important. Three grabbed his hand as she whispered in his ear. You can use me any way you want. I'm all yours. I bet you like it sloppy. We've reached another adult scene. Thanks YouTube. Now, on to the next scene. Aiden looked over his shoulder, then pushed himself off the bed and left the room. Aiden, you're still naked. Seven shouted. Go get changed. I don't want to see your cock flopping around. That can wait. I have a question, Aiden replied. What was with the blood in that goblet? I feel fantastic. It's the purest form of Lamia's blood, Seven explained. Like myself, one is a child of Lamia. His blood is 100% pure. In other words, it's straight from the teat. Receiving our blood is the highest privilege. You can drink Lylin blood from any demon, but it's closer to 3%. It wouldn't benefit you much at all. Aiden looked outside and pondered. Seven ate a piece of his candy and chuckled. Adrenochrome is fucking apple juice compared to keeper blood. He's almost here, the voices whispered. You are too late. Tell him you're staying. Tell him to leave. Aiden raced to his room and got changed. He heard a man scream and shout from the living room, grabbing his undivided attention. Aiden ran toward the commotion and froze after what he saw. The front door had broken off of its hinges and was on the floor. The door handle was missing due to a shotgun blast, with Edward standing in the doorway, while carrying a Platinum Remington Volt 3 TAC-13 shotgun. There was a Guardian of Patience crest on the stock. Edward pointed it at Six and aimed down the sights. His hands were shaky with sweat trickling into his eyes. Where the fuck is my boy? Six took him seriously and slowly raised his hands. Your son is no longer here, Mr. Newbold. You have my word. You're shy about 30 minutes. 4 walked out of the kitchen while eating an apple and dropped it once he saw Edward. The startled keeper morphed into a fallen angel, his true form, and leaped toward him as he horizontally spun in a clockwise motion with his 6 raven black wings. It protected his body like a suit of armor. Edward saw the keeper in his peripheral vision and fired a slug. The gunshot hit Four's shoulder, forcing him to crash into the wooden floor. A swarm of flies flew out of the ventilation system and made a silhouette of Beelzebub, keeper of flies. Edward shot another slug, making the flies scatter to a closer position. 2 swayed back and forth in an attempt to distract Edward before lunging at him. He shot another slug, hitting the majority of her swarm. Black viscous ichor coated the couch behind her. Edward reloaded his shotgun with shaky hands. "Where is my son?" I then reached out to his father from afar. "Stop." Edward turned to him and lowered his gun. It was impossible to hide his quivering lip. "Son, you were right. Let's go home." I then knitted his brows. "I am home. Why are you hurting them? They're like family. You should leave, Dad. These demons aren't your family." Edward screamed. "They are feeding you lies. They are grooming you for their evil schemes. I am your family," he whimpered. "I need you. You're all I have left. They've given me an amazing gift, and I don't have the words to articulate how good I feel." I then explained. "They've given me everything. They shower me with women. They've wiped away all of my doubts and fears. I can speak any language I want. I can do anything." Edward fell to his knees as he stared at the floor. He bowed his head and wiped his teary eyes before looking at his son once again. "I can't give you the world, but I can give you a father's love. Please, son, I can't lose you too. You're all I have. Please, come home with me and forget about them." I then turned and ambled to his room. Before he walked up the staircase, he looked over his shoulder. "Fuck off," he said in Russian. Edward dropped his gun on the floor. 6 lowered his hands as he approached Edward. He knelt down, leaning toward him. "As I said, Mr. Newbold," he whispered, "your son is no longer here." 6 adjusted his watch to check the time. "You're about 40 minutes shy," he said, gently patting Edward's shoulder. "I highly advise you to leave before I order someone to blow your fucking face off." Tears trickled down Edward's face. He looked at 6 and nodded as his lips quivered. Slowly but surely, he helped himself onto his feet and stared at the staircase that led to the 2nd floor. 6 checked his watch once again before patiently watching him. Edward turned to the doorway and ambled out of the house. 7 slammed the door shut and stood next to 6 with his bag of candy. "I'll talk to the boy tomorrow." Azrael must have intervened. There's no other explanation. 6 looked over his shoulder. "If we act quickly, we can take that shotgun to Yggdrasil and get this war back in our favor." 7 shook the bottom of his brown paper bag before looking at him. "I will take Iden to see him. Stay with the others and help them recover." 6 knelt next to his siblings. "As you wish, brother. I'll let Asmodeus have her fun with Iden," 7 said, leaving the room. "We'll leave when dusk approaches." Many hours had passed. The keepers called in the professionals to patrol the mansion grounds. Iden walked out of his room, breathing heavily and covered in 3's sweat. 7 saw him and popped a piece of candy into his mouth. "You're enjoying luxurious company, I see." Iden wiped his forehead with his forearm. "She has the best P-word I've ever had." 7 cocked his head as he squinted his eyes. "What? Shut up. She's the only P-word you've ever had." I then glanced at the floor and cleared his throat. 7 ambled to the living room. "Get changed. Now, we're going to visit Yggdrasil." I then returned to his room and jumped in the shower. When he got out, he saw unread messages on his phone. The first read, "Are you okay, babe? I haven't seen you in days. Text me back. Megan, heart emoji." I then tapped on the next message. It read, "Hey dude, I haven't seen you at school at all. Where have you been? I'm around if you need me. See, I then forgot his friends and regretted the conversation he had with his father. He thought of a plan to give them more of his time. I'm going to change, but for now, they can wait, he thought. I have to see Yggdrasil first. He walked out of his room and jumped over the railing, landing into the living room. 7 stared at him with raised eyebrows. You are finally ready. I then stuffed his hands into his pockets. Yeah, let's go. They hopped into 6's car, and 7 drove them to the Lion and Phoenix. They were silent for the duration of the car ride. I then stared out of his window, trapped in his own thoughts. I hope Dad doesn't hate me. 7 pulled into the parking lot and picked a spot. They got out of the car and approached the club entrance. A Cerberus agent grimaced at the sight of them. Why are you and your fucking dog here? I then unsheathed the shotgun and held the back of his hand up. We're here to find out what the fuck this was doing in the hands of a human. The agents stepped aside and opened the door. Club music blared out of the speakers of the club. Like always, Nephilim and Lylin had tables of their own. Some were on the dance floor while others danced on each other, completely naked. Iden and 7 made a beeline to the elevator and traveled down to Yggdrasil's study. On their way down, they listened to the smooth jazz playing through the speakers. 7 hummed to the music while he ate his candy. The door opened, and they saw Yggdrasil looming over his fireplace. Classical music played out of his vinyl turntable. Yggdrasil, Iden shouted as he threw the shotgun onto his desk. I have something to show you. Yggdrasil heard the loud thud and turned to them. Azrael's crest. What are you doing with this? Iden crossed his arms. My question to you is, how did a human, more specifically my father, get his hands on the gun? Yggdrasil rested his chin on his index finger and thumb. Your father had a Nephilim weapon in his possession. Most interesting. He showed up with the intent of killing the keepers. Iden replied. Yggdrasil knitted his eyebrows and crossed his arms. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I will send agents to investigate. If this becomes serious, I'll get to the bottom of this myself. You have my word, Ira. 7 nodded. Thank you. Yggdrasil sat down at his desk. Iden and 7 made their way to the first floor. 7 looked at Iden with a smirk on his face. That was rough, but you did good, kiddo. Thank you, Iden replied. After drinking that blood, I feel like a different person. Without it, life felt monotonous. 7 raised a brow. Like you were just fed the biggest hit of dopamine you will ever feel in your entire life. Iden's eyes broadened. Exactly. I was born of this, 7 said as he ate his candy. I've never known the difference. They left the club and drove out of the parking lot. As soon as they arrived, 7 checked on his siblings. Beulah, Superbia, how are they? 6 turned to him with his hands folded behind his back. I gave them an NSQ. Their physical bodies will restore in time. What's an NSQ? I then asked. My apologies, boy, 6 replied. That's a conversation for another time. I then made his way to his room. I'm gonna go and do my own thing. Just creep through the floor or something if you need me. When he jumped out of the shower, he invited Cholly and Megan over. An hour later, they arrived at the front door and were greeted by the house butler. Megan knocked on his bedroom door and waited with Cholly by her side, but no one answered. Minutes passed and she grew impatient. Fuck this, she muttered, lock-picking the door. Moments later, she walked inside. Cholly closely followed. They saw a silhouette of Iden, who stood in the shadowy corner of his somber room. Iden. Megan called out. He looked at her, revealing his blood-red eyes. A child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Megan and Cholly ambled toward him. Iden, Cholly said. What's up, man? Iden glared at them. They stared back. Iden stepped out of the shadows giving them a closer look at his unworldly eyes. Charlie fainted and collapsed onto the wooden floor. I then jumped over the bed and knelt next to him. "Oh shit, I thought doing that would make me look cool." Megan slapped his arm with the backside of her hand. "I think Charlie shit himself." What the fuck was that? Aiden raised the inside corners of his brows. "My bad. I won't do it again, I promise." Megan grabbed Charlie's shoulders. "You better not. Help me get Charlie. Say sorry when he wakes up, you fucker." Aiden grabbed Charlie's shirt and placed him on the bed with ease. Megan used her jacket to fan Charlie's face. Aiden smirked at Megan. "So, how come you didn't faint when you saw me?" Charlie slowly opened his eyes. "Because she's a bad bitch." Aiden wore a lopsided grin. "I'm sorry for scaring you. I had to do it." "It's okay," Charlie replied. "I'm pretty sure I'll need a pacemaker after that. But what is life without a little excitement? I need to catch you both up on a few things," Aiden said as he sat on his desk chair. "You have to absolutely keep this to yourselves." They paid close attention to Aiden and sat on the edge of his bed. "I've seen angels. I drank demon blood." He felt Six's presence and looked in his direction. Six walked into the room with knitted brows. "Yggdrasil found something. He wants you to be there," he said, locking his hands together. Aiden nodded and turned to his friends. "I'm sorry. I'll continue where we left off." Charlie gave him a fist bump. Then Megan gently kissed his cheek, and they left the house. Aiden made sure his friends were off the property before leaving. When it was their turn to leave, Six drove him to Yggdrasil's coordinates. "All right, I pretty much told my friends what's going on." Aiden thought, "It's time to apologize to Dad for being an asshole when this is all finished." The closer they drove to the location, the more Aiden recognized the area. "This is my old neighborhood." They arrived at the destination and pulled into the driveway. Six turned to Aiden and noticed him quivering in his seat. "Aiden, what's the matter, dear boy?" "This," Aiden replied, "is my father's house." "Oh, I see," Six said, staring at the front door. "I'm going inside. Take a deep breath and come in when you're ready." Breathing heavily, Aiden stared at his shaking hands. He thought about all of the things that could be waiting for him behind the door. He wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. Moments later, he gained the strength to enter his father's home. Aiden opened the door and saw a squad of Cerberus agents investigating the scene. Traces of blood started from the door and trailed into Edward's bedroom. He saw Edward's favorite rug by the staircase. It was drenched in blood. He ambled toward his father's bedroom and saw Yggdrasil, who obscured his view of the room. Yggdrasil looked over his shoulder with a tight-lipped frown. "I'm sorry, child. Leviathan just told me who the owner of the house was. My men were not fast enough." Yggdrasil walked away and Aiden dropped to his knees. Edward was impaled by a bed of spears. Each spear had the patient's crest on it. Half of Edward's face had been destroyed, making it nearly impossible to identify him. A piece of Aiden chipped off and shattered onto the floor that day. It irreversibly broke him. "You should go, child," Yggdrasil said as he took notes. "You shouldn't see your father this way." Aiden helped himself onto his feet and ambled out of the house. A few weeks later, Aiden, Seven, Megan, and Charlie went to Edward's grave. Each of them loomed over his tombstone. Down on his knees, Aiden bowed his head and wept into his hands until he couldn't produce tears any longer. Seven buried his face into his bag of candy. "He's been dead for weeks now. Let's go already." Aiden jumped onto his feet and screamed in Seven's face, screaming at the top of his lungs. He thrust his hand into Seven's chest and clenched his heart before ripping it from his body. Seven's eyes rolled into the back of his head before he collapsed onto the muddy grounds of the cemetery. Aiden held the heart above his head and tore it in half. Breathing heavily, I then loomed over Seven's corpse. His lifeless body writhed until it stood up on its own. I then and his friends saw Seven's body regenerate at an unworldly rate. Okay, I get it, Seven said, walking away. Don't do that ever again. I then turned to his father's grave and knelt next to it once again. I'm so sorry, he whimpered as he wept in his hands. I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have let you know how much I love you. I should have been there for you. I'm so sorry. Megan squatted next to him and rested her head on his shoulder. I promise to always be here for you, she said with trembling lips. You are stuck with me for life. Sorry. Charlie wiped the tears from his eyes. Yeah, if you need a place to stay, my door is always open. The last thing I said to him was to fuck off in Russian. I then whimpered. A light drizzle turned into heavy rain. Come on, let's go, Megan shouted. It's starting to come down hard. You two go ahead, I then replied. I need to finish my goodbyes. Charlie and Megan darted for the car and patiently waited for him. I then sat on the ground with his knees raised. Drained of tears, he rested his elbows on his knees and listened to a song through his phone. He knitted his brows as he read his father's name. I will have my revenge, he said in Russian.